From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. February 1st, 1999 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Royal Rumble Recap. 1998'S Business Rundown. Plus tons of news. By Observer staff. So all records were destroyed this year. WWF increased its attendance 71.7% over the previous year, increased television ratings 48.9% and increased pay-per-view buy rates 67.2%, from a 0.61 average in 1997 to a 1.02 average, sold out 33.5% of its house shows as compared with 16.7% last year, and averaged $188,482 gross per house show as compared with $94,562 last year, increase of 99.3%. WCW had tremendous increases as well, increasing attendance 46.7%, television ratings 56.0%, pay-per-view buy rates 17.7%, 0.79 to 0.93, sold out 48.8% of its house shows as compared with 40.5% last year, average $166,190 gross per house show as compared with $87,413 last year, or a 90.1% increase. Between the two companies, the total wrestling attendance for the year was probably about 3,850,000, generating about $78 million, roughly $38 million for WCW and $40 million for WWF. The combined money figure may be the biggest in the history of pro wrestling in North America, although there have been time periods in the past when attendance was far larger, although ticket prices in those eras was far less. Total attendance for pro wrestling in North America, including all indies, was probably about 4,500,000, which is a better number than previous few years but nowhere close to a high water mark. During the early 80s, before the business constricted and got more popular, pro wrestling was drawing between 10 million and 13 million fans per year. During its first network television peak in the early 50s, when virtually every city of any size was having weekly live shows, attendance was estimated at 24 million annually. There were years in the 80s where WWF hit the $40 million mark on house show revenue, but that was during a time period when it was running 3 tours and close to 1,000 house shows per year as opposed to around 200 shows this year. Of course, in those days ticket prices were also about half of what they are today. So as far as total paid attendance, WWF events this year was only about half of what it was at the peak, but it was half the attendance, running 1/5 as many shows, so overall touring has to be considered as far more profitable for the WWF this year than ever before. WCW grossed approximately $49.6 million off its 12 pay-per-view events this past year, while WWF grossed approximately $54.7 million, both totals easily breaking all-time records for each company. If you take WrestleMania out of the mix, WWF averaged in 0.90 buy rate, so really the one show was the total difference when it comes to WWF's lead over WCW in pay-per-view, although as in all categories, as the year went on, WWF decidedly held the overall advantage. These figures all have to be questioned to this point. The cable industry itself claimed pro wrestling pay-per-view revenue in 1998 at $178 million. Total revenue including viewers' choice and cable companies 57% of the pie, but using these figures if they are accurate, that number would be $243 million, and that isn't even adding in ECW or more than total pay-per-view revenue from all sources, according to the recent Showtime survey, which included other sports and live performances like boxing, UFC, as well as concerts. In other words, either the Showtime survey drastically underplayed pro wrestling and the industry as a whole, which is highly doubtful, or these companies are exaggerating their business to a huge degree, since figures we are using from outside sources are generally 10 to 15% lower than what WWF and WCW respectively claim in the first place. I can say that the house show numbers are the authentic article in both WWF and WCW's cases, as they are easy to check, whereas pay-per-view is virtually impossible to accurately check. Realistically, WCW peaked in March and has been on a decline ever since, while WWF's peak was in December and only seems to be on the ascent. As far as comparing the two companies for the year, both nearly doubled their per-event revenue, and WCW actually increased house show revenue even greater than WWF over the past year because it ran more shows. But overall, with WCW doing slightly more shows and WWF averaging slightly more per show, Both companies were close in house show revenue, WWF holding a slight lead. WCW had higher television ratings. WWF drew a higher average attendance per show and won slightly in pay-per-view. WCW sold out a greater percentage of its shows, and while WCW looks better in these listings when it comes to TV ratings, it has 2 lower rated shows factored in all year and Heat only for 3 months, while WCW had Thunder all year and only 1 weekend show factored in. Realistically, for the year it was probably a close win for WWF if we are comparing both companies from a success at business standpoint. One would argue WWF should be even more successful given that WCW had a significantly higher talent payroll, although as mentioned here many times, in comparing revenue drawn with talent payroll, wrestling is far below the standards of every other major sport and probably most of entertainment as well, but with WCW dominating in the first half of the year and WWF dominating in the second half. For All Japan Pro Wrestling, as compared with last year, the company was behind in attendance but held steady when it came to television ratings. All Japan averaged 2,243 fans per regular house show. The actual average in magazines would be higher because we don't include major shows in the total, as compared with 2,487 last year, both of which would be probably the lowest totals of the decade, a drop of 9.8%. All Japan was in the worst attendance slump probably of its 26-year history from April through October, picking up noticeably over the last 2 months of the year with the tag team tournament, although even the tournament was still behind last year. Whatever decline in attendance there was as far as revenue for the year was taken care of, and then some, by the first Tokyo Dome show generating millions of dollars. All Japan played to 41.6% sellouts in 1998 as compared to 39.1% in 1997, which says part of the reason crowds were down is they were playing smaller venues. Television ratings were basically a wash, with the 1998 average of 3.33 slightly topping the 1997 average of 3.29, mainly because ratings really picked up toward the end of the year. New Japan was the opposite. Not including major shows, it increased attendance from a 3,938 per show average to 4,124, which is a slight 4.7% increase. The sellout percentage remained basically the same, at 53.0% as compared to 53.9% last year. Television ratings for New Japan, however, showed a significant decline for the year of 17.2% from 3.18 to 2.63. That basically means a decline in casual fan interest, which isn't a good sign for the future, but a maintenance of ticket buying interest. Whatever the plans were for All Japan Pro Wrestling's main focus leading up to its Tokyo Dome show were thrown for a loop when Toshiaki Kawada suffered a broken right wrist and forearm early in his Triple Crown title win over Mitsuharu Misawa on January 22 at Osaka Furitsu Gym before 5,300 fans. Kawada scored only his second career victory over Misawa in a singles match, the first one being May 1 at the Tokyo Dome last year, pinned Misawa in 24-15 of what was said to have been another in their legendary series of outstanding matches after a brainbuster, the same move leading to his Tokyo Dome win. The match aired 2 nights later on television and did a 5.4 rating for the 45-minute special. Nippon TV will be doing another 45-minute special on March 7th, and if the ratings continue as strong as they have been, the show will probably be expanded to 45 minutes regularly later this year. From the tape, it appeared Kawada broke his arm 7 minutes into the match when he delivered an attempted spinning backfist, a move popularized in K1 of late, but wound up delivering basically a spinning elbow to the back of Misawa's head with such force that both his wrist and forearm were broken. Kawada worked the remainder of the match and used the arm for throws and moves, although he didn't use the arm for any strikes. The finishing sequence of the match saw Kawada hit a brainbuster, followed by an attempt at a power bomb which Misawa blocked. Kawada then delivered a new maneuver, described as a combination vertical suplex dropped into a power bomb, followed by a high kick to the face and a second brainbuster, to get the 3 count. The idea was for the win to lead to a Kawada vs. Vader Triple Crown title match on March 6 at Budokan Hall, which would be the first singles meeting ever between the two. With the April Budokan show not headlined by the Triple Crown, since it will be the finals of the annual Champion Carnival tournament, it would almost assuredly wind up with the Kawada Vader winner facing Misawa on May 2 at All Japan's second ever Dome show. One would suspect, although it's not a certain, that Vader would have beaten Kawada for the title, since that would mean Vader would go into the Dome having pinned both Kawada and Kenta Kobashi, and defending against the company's biggest star in their first ever singles meeting. But whatever the plans were, to an extent they will have to be changed. Kawada underwent an operation on January 25 on his right arm which went successfully, and the belief is that he will be out of action until the Dome show. He immediately told the press that he was going to have to vacate the title. Misawa told the press on January 27 that he hasn't decided what he's going to do in regard to the title, mentioning that they will either hold a tournament or set up a match between the top two contenders on March 6 for the title. Apparently there is hope that even though the doctor said Kawada shouldn't return for 3 months, that perhaps he could return and do the 3/6 Budokan show against Vader anyway, although at this point that isn't considered a very likely possibility. The obvious answer would be to decide the title at the Champion Carnival tournament, but in a promotion that relies on logic, there are 3 problems with it. The first is that there would be no champion and thus no important singles main event for 3/6. The second is that Vader won't be the champion and will most likely have to do his elusive first singles job, unless they book him in several draws, at some point in the tournament, which will weaken his position in the Dome main event. If he were to go into Carnival as the champion, he could do one job to Kawada or Kobashi and do a draw or 2 without significantly weakening his drawing power for the Dome against Misawa. The third is that with the tournament finals set for mid-April at Budokan, somehow all Japan would have to come out of that tournament with a strong enough singles issue for the Dome, in that both Misawa and Vader would have to be protected, and only have a little more than 2 weeks to build up the main event. There was speculation initially when word got out regarding Kawada's injury that the title would be put up in a tournament with the finals on March 6, but that would mean doing singles tournaments with the exact same wrestlers on 2 consecutive tours. But doing the singles match between the top contenders isn't an easy answer, because it would almost have to be Misawa versus Vader, which is the match they look to be saving for the Dome. The fact there are no easy answers explains why Misawa hasn't come to any conclusion at press time. Over the past 16 years, since Kawada made his pro wrestling debut, he and Misawa have had 17 singles matches, with Misawa winning 10, losing 2 and the other 5 ending in time limit draws. However, on their past 5 singles matches, Kawada has won 2 and there were 2 draws. From a traditional standpoint of the winner of the Royal Rumble facing the WWF champion at WrestleMania, it would appear that the Mania main event would be Rock versus Vince McMahon. Of course that won't be the case. By Raw the next night, it was seemingly made clear that Steve Austin was appointed by Shawn Michaels as the #1 contender for the WrestleMania title shot, presumably at The Rock, although a Rock vs. Mankind empty arena match was announced for halftime of the Super Bowl on the USA Network. In addition, an Austin vs. McMahon cage match was announced to headline the WWF's next pay-per-view on February 14 from Memphis, with McMahon winning the Rumble and Rock capturing the WWF title from Mankind on January 24 at the Arrowhead Pond in Anaheim, California. It would appear there are many angles left to be had as well. The Rumble sold out weeks in advance to the tune of 14,816 fans, 13,597 paying $630,050, and another $137,813 in merchandise. Was an interesting show to look at. Judging from the huge rating, 4.77, for Sunday Night Heat, an incredible number when you figure every hardcore WWF fan on the West Coast wasn't watching the show, as it was head-to-head with the pay-per-view. One would figure the buy rate for Rumble was huge. One would figure that even without the Heat rating. As a produced event, it was spectacular even by WWF standards, with great videos, admitted almost all of which had already aired on free television, some interesting booking twists, even if the final results were predictable, and some well-produced ideas which took place outside the ring. As far as wrestling, there was nothing on the show that really stood out, and in that regard the show was a disappointment. The Rumble showcased badly the WWF's lack of depth, which couldn't even be hidden by booking the event around Austin going to the hospital after a supposed savage beating, only for him to return for the finish, and not only that, return unscathed without selling even the semblance of a beating. The finish of the Mankind vs. Rock I Quit match was savage in its brutality, many would say needlessly savage, but ultimately was a screw job. The new direction of the WWF, and American wrestling in general, has a lot of strong points as evidenced by the strength of business right now, but isn't conducive to putting on entertaining pay-per-view shows because fans don't have the attention spans to watch matches for more than 8 minutes, and fans only care about a few major issues, making even well-worked short matches, X-Pac vs. Gangrel as an example, almost devoid of heat in WWF. This also seemed to have been a toned-down WWF, both on this show and on the Raw the next night. Aside from the well-publicized situation in Winnipeg, there have been a lot of less publicized complaints about the product, set off it appears largely by the angle where Mark Henry was getting what was certainly portrayed as simulated oral sex from a guy going up his pants only to find out it was a guy. There were a lot of rumors about some important people, sponsors, starting to become uncomfortable, although WWF has always denied any sponsor problems, and the fact is WWF sponsorship at present is at an all-time high. The fact is that the WWF has more than enough going for it that it doesn't need anything silly to try and push standards of television and risk someone pushing back when success is at this level. The risk versus rewards ratio has changed quite a bit over the last 6 months and nobody is going to complain, or really notice, a slightly toned down product. On pay-per-view, where there should be the ability to get more risque because one has to make the conscious effort to buy the show, the promised Undertaker human sacrifice of a surprise, with Mabel adding to the list of WWF's disappointing surprises that now includes Jimmy Snuka, Rockabilly and Dwayne Gill, was toned down to simply putting him in a hearse, and he wound up as the latest in Undertaker's collection of colorless cronies which threatened to turn him into a late 1998 Hogan with the NWO black and white. There was far less vulgarity or lewd gestures. 1 or 2 examples of flipping off, but that was about. Instead, they replaced it with angles involving Austin throughout the show. Turned away from the building by security unless he showed up in a limo, but blockaded from the building at the same time, arriving in a combination limo and monster truck running over the blockade, jumped in the bathroom and taken unconscious in an ambulance to the hospital, but returning, unscathed, to eliminate half the world as most of the Rumble participants were basically props to keep the show going with none either being allowed to making the effort to display anything to get themselves over, only to lose at the end to the boss, who, despite looking like a large bodybuilder with mismatched parts in an over 50 contest, was specifically detailed by his announcing crew as not being an athlete or a wrestler. In a dark match, Christian J. Resso pinned Jeff Hardy in 11 minutes with Christian's finisher, which is the Tommy Rogers Tomahawk. This was said to have been the second best match on the entire show. McMahon opened with an interview saying that Austin had 30 minutes to arrive, but also showing the building being blockaded to keep him from coming. He also announced a mystery opponent for Mankind on the Heat show. Bob Holly, Robert Howard, and Scorpio, Charles Skaggs, beat Scott Taylor and Brian Lawler, in 3:52 when Holly pinned Christopher. It appears from their lack of push or focus and their gimmick being toned down, that the too much waiting scheduled for the February 14th show in Memphis has been cancelled. One, if not both of the participants wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea of doing it, and with it whatever push they may have gotten from it. The work was good but the crowd didn't care, which may turn out to be the subtext for most of wrestling in 1999. The match was mainly just a way to set up the Acolytes attacking the Job Squad, to set up Undertaker and an even more hideously made-up Paul Bearer coming to the ring for an interview. The crowd still popped for Undertaker as a star of the show, even if they didn't seem to like his interview a bit. Sable then did an interview and was attacked by Luna, who gave her a backbreaker. They acted as if Sable wasn't going to be able to wrestle later in the show. The angle was lame, and didn't they just do almost the same angle on a pre-game show before the Sable-Jacqueline title change match? McMahon did his second interview, at which point Austin broke through the barricades in his limo monster truck. Austin got in the ring but wasn't allowed to hit McMahon unless it was in a match. McMahon slapped Austin and ran, leaving Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe to take a few bumps. Mankind, Michael Foley, beat the Masked Mystery Man, Mabel aka Nelson Frazier Jr., in 5:04 via DQ. It was evident who it was, as if 6'8", 500-pound men can walk around unrecognized because they are wearing a mask. With Giant coming in, I'm not sure of the purpose in bringing another giant slug into the company. Match was awful, and even with Mankind involved, it drew no heat at all. They kept emphasizing that Mankind had never submitted in a match in his career. For all the knocks at Tony Schiavone for saying Flair had never put up his hair when he did 20 years ago, the WWF saying that was pretty lame since he tapped out against Ken Shamrock in October on pay-per-view, and over the course of his career the total would be countless. Then again, later in the show they said the same thing about Billy Gunn. I guess we should just make a blanket statement for every announcer to repeat in every match that no wrestler in history has ever submitted in a match, and even when they do, they still haven't. That way we can ensure that whenever someone puts on a submission hold, the crowd won't react. Mabel is the worst. Mankind put on the Socko Claw and Rock interfered for the DQ with a rock bottom, and Mabel splashed him after the match. Rock was putting the boots to Mankind afterwards, and Shane McMahon jumped from the announcing position to get a shot in as well. -1 star. 1. Big Boss Man Ray Traylor pinned Jesse Jam Brian James in 11:52. Originally this was to be a non-title match under hardcore rules, but the Stips were eliminated later in the week. Solid opener with good heat early, but the reactions died down as the match progressed. In recent weeks when they've been split up, it's become pretty clear that Jesse Jam has a lot of charisma on his own, and that Billy Gunn was one incredibly fortunate performer the past year. Bossman suffered a small cut on the bridge of his nose. Bossman won clean with the Bossman Slam. 2 stars. 2. Ken Shamrock retained the IC title beating Billy Gunn, Monty Sopp, in 14:24. Shamrock controlled most of the match and worked a very physical style. Gunn must have done something because he got killed in every angle, got killed most of the match, and still did the job clean at the end. Gunn also didn't do much of anything during the match as it appeared Shamrock was carrying things, and the crowd wasn't carrying much. Kind of made the IC title look like a preliminary belt with a lack of crowd interest. Biggest bump saw Shamrock take a facebuster off the apron and onto a table. Ref Tim White took a clumsy ref bump off a poorly set up Shamrock clothesline. In a good false finish, Val Venus did a run-in and gave Shamrock a DDT, but he kicked out of the fall. Gunn then came off the top rope for apparently no reason as Shamrock was nowhere close, landed on his feet, sold his injured ankle, that the announcers were talking about during the match but which he never actually sold during the match, and Shamrock put him in the ankle lock for the tap out. However, just to refresh your memory, Billy Gunn has still never submitted in his entire career. 1 1/4 star. 3. X-Pac, Sean Waltman, retained the European title pinning Gangrel David Heath in 5:53. Real good fast-paced action but again lacking in crowd heat. X-Pac did several perfectly timed spinning heel kicks. The only negative to the match, aside from it being terribly rushed, was a spot where Gangrel was supposed to roll through on a crossbody. He didn't roll through and the two were caught in mid-position. Ref Teddy Long then screwed things up by counting 3 for what was a planned near fall. Crowd booed and chanted "You but the guys," which killed the build for the finish and X Factor, Facebuster, which occurred moments later. 2.5 stars. 4. Sable, Rena Mero, beat Luna, Gertrude Vachon Heath, in 4:43 of a strap match. Again no heat even with the pre-show angle. They teased Sable wouldn't be there and would have to vacate the title, but Sable showed up, and at least she was selling her back. They whipped each other hard with the straps and kicked each other stiff, but in this new environment of doing a strap match it was clear Sable's lack of experience. They did the same finish of 90% of the strap matches in history, where the heel is dragging the face around the ring and touching 3 turnbuckles, and the face, unbeknownst to the heel, is also touching them, and logically that finish never made sense anyway since the only way to win was to drag your opponent around the ring and touch all 4 buckles, and in the usual finish, the face isn't dragging anyone around. Shane McMahon got on the apron for some reason. Terry Pac, called the stalker from the crowd, which I guess makes her Barry Windham's sister, came out of the crowd and punched Luna, and Sable hit the 4th turnbuckle to win. Bad stuff. Dud. 5. Rock, Dwayne Johnson, regained the WWF title from Mankind, Michael Foley, in an I Quit match in 21:46. Congratulations to Brian Alvarez on the Observer hotline for picking the finish correctly, about them playing a tape of Mankind saying I quit. This was sort of given away on the pregame show when Mankind used those words in his interview and Shane McMahon reacted to it as if he had fallen into the trap. Very good match. But this won't be remembered as a classic I Quit match with the Funk vs. Flair and Magnum TA vs. Tully Blanchard matches, partially because of the finish. They used the mic back and forth where one would ask the other if they quit. When Mankind asked, Rock tried to play cool heel with defiant remarks that a face should make. When Rock asked, Mankind at least sold that he was near death but would still refuse. At least one of the guys got it. Mankind took his ungodly punishment. The heat beating really didn't play much into the match as Rock never worked on Mankind's back or ribs nor did he come out taped up. Mankind put the double-arm DDT and Mr. Socko Claw on. Rock passed out so couldn't say I quit. Did Mankind say in an interview he wasn't going to use any submission holds in the match? Rock got the ring bell and the hammer and gonged the bell in his ears, which, unless you've had it happen to you, is more of a jolt than most people in the crowd would be able to empathize with. They were supposed to do a rock bottom on the Spanish announcer's table, but that table looked to be made out of papier-mâché the way it broke so easily while both guys were just standing setting the move up. Rock spit water in Mankind's eyes but Mankind came back and posted Rock. They were brawling on the floor and Rock hit a DDT. Rock went backstage and got a ladder. It was set up near a section of risers and both men climbed up the ladder and brawled on the wrong side of the rail about 9 feet from the floor. The only problem with this spot, which looked pretty dangerous to be fighting with little footing so high off the ground, was you knew Rock wasn't about to take a bump from there. In fact, one of the problems with this match was it was evident Rock wasn't going to take any punishment while Foley was going to take a ton, so it was more like a stuntman show with a few spots being set up than a tension-filled wrestling match. Anyway, Mankind took the bump, landing on what was supposed to have been the electrical circuit boards, which appeared to be totally gimmicked, with a big flash coming from the circuits as he did them and knocking the power out in the building. With Mankind dead, Shane McMahon came out and pleased with Rock to end the match, but he wouldn't. Rock handcuffed Mankind's hands behind his back and threw him in the ring and destroyed him. Mankind juiced, but came back with a low kick, stomping, biting, and a knee to the groin. Rock, being the experienced pro at selling and putting his foe over that he is, Rock's shortcomings in the ring, not evident much in recent months, were really getting exposed in this match because the style necessitated selling moves and body part injuries to get it over as opposed to fast-paced action mixed with wrist holds. Got right up from the low blows without selling much and made a comeback, with the corporate elbow on a chair into Mankind's face. At this point it was sick chair shot city, with overkill to the point of 11 full-force brutal chair shots to the head, leaving Mankind in the aisle covered in blood when the tape played over the loudspeaker of him saying "I quit," taped during his Heat interview. They brought out a stretcher, but he refused the stretcher job, although they were already into the next segment before showing him getting up and walking off on his own to a big reaction. This finish, and I'm not talking about the screw job aspect of it, didn't remotely qualify as entertainment. Maybe caring that a guy who was formerly such a brilliant performer may wind up with no brain cells later in life qualifies you as someone who doesn't get it. There was one very interesting difference in phone calls here. After the Hell in the Cell match, probably 80% of the calls were glowing about Foley's performance and maybe 20% were concerned about the mentality of doing so. Both sides were right, since they should have been concerned, but if you understand Foley's dreams, it was a good thing, too. This time the calls were 90% negative toward the finish and almost nobody was raving in awe about the punishment Foley took and were more mad at him for his lack of common sense than empathizing with him for the pain he was willing to suffer for the sake of entertainment and to make the match memorable. He could have accomplished the same thing with 3 chair shots. I do want to point out, not in defense of Foley, but that I've seen people before take every bit as many shots every bit as hard or harder to the head, although in those cases, while the shots may have been harder, they were more carefully delivered as to being all on the top of the head where the skull is thickest, whereas Rock was just swinging it like a baseball bat wherever it would hit, before, and I'd bet for pennies to dollars on their financial payoff for it. It wasn't anything unprecedented and there is a lot of money involved in the business nowadays, but hopefully we'll never have to see anything like it again. 3 3/4 stars. 6. Vince McMahon won the Royal Rumble in 56-38. It was never specified how long it would be between people joining in, and it was just as well, as there seemed to be no set time. It seemed as if they were working on a 90 seconds deal as the idea, but they'd give it more or less time depending on how they saw fit. McMahon started with Austin. McMahon came out with the oil and tan in a bottle that bodybuilders use coming on stage, walking around like a contest bodybuilder with the famous pro wrestling male mascaras walk, a guy in his late 40s or 50s strutting around sucking in his gut. Austin basically stomped the hell out of McMahon, who facially sold like a pro's pro and even took one bump, body slam. McMahon got one low kick in. Golga was next in, but just stood there letting the two go at it until jumping Austin. Austin threw Golga out in 2:17. Austin and McMahon wound up brawling back to a women's bathroom, where Team Corporate destroyed Austin and left him for dead. Droz was in next and had the ring to himself before Edge came in. Gilbert was in next and he lasted seconds, as Edge threw him out at 6:49. Steve Blackman was in next. It was turning into a jobber battle royal and nobody cared, particularly when Dan Severn and Tiger Ali Singh came in. Crowd was dead and so was the match. Blue Meanie was in next. Then first nobody came out, but backstage they showed Mabel beating up Mosh and Mabel came in. Mabel started cleaning house. Oh my god. He's gonna stay this time, throwing out Blackman and Severn at 15:43, Singh at 15:47, Droz and Meanie at 16:12 and Edge at 16:30. This left Jesse Jam, who had just shown up, with Mabel. The lights went out at this point and Undertaker's music played. The Acolytes and Midian hit the ring and they decided to attack Mabel, dragging him away at 17:10. Hopefully he went over the top rope or he may be able to show back up in the ring on Tuesday and be declared the winner. They put him in the back of a hearse and drove him off. Gangrel came in to give Jam opposition, but he lasted all of 40 seconds before going out at 19:18. After another 35 seconds where literally nothing happened, Kurgan showed up, and the next 90 seconds were worse than the previous 35. Al Snow was next in, but Jam threw him out at 21:18. Goldust was in next. Next came Godfather, whose music got a pop. The Hoes came out, but then when they left, the crowd, which didn't care about anything in the ring by this point, started booing and chanting "We want Hoes." Instead they got Kane, who got to be the second Mabel, and what a compliment that is, throwing out Jam at 26:54, Kurgan at 26:55, Godfather at 27 minutes and Goldust at 27:09. The orderlies showed up. Kane gave one a choke slam, and he jumped over the top rope at 27:40, eliminating himself and ran away. Crowd was groaning again over that one. Vince McMahon showed back up, wearing his sweatshirt so he wouldn't have to keep tense like a bodybuilder while sitting at ringside doing commentary for the next 30 minutes. The ring was empty at this point. Ken Shamrock showed up with his bug eyes for 147 waiting while Vince was making some point before Billy Gunn came in. Test was in next. The ambulance came back at this point, with Austin driving it. Ray Charles saw that one coming, and he wasn't hurt to boot. Austin ran back in and went after McMahon, but he was attacked by Shamrock. Bossman came in. Austin threw out Shamrock in 33:30. Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Val Venus were the next to enter. Austin threw out Billy Gunn at 37:07. X-Pac and Mark Henry were in next. Then came Jeff Jarrett, better known as Deborah, formerly McMichael's escort, who got a huge reaction coming out. That guy has some charisma. Unfortunately, when the crowd saw Deborah go to the back, the crowd died before Jarrett even made it to the ring. D'Lo Brown was in next, with Jacqueline and Terry Runnels with him. Please don't even try and get me to make sense out of that. The crowd figured it out by this point that they were going to the back as well. It was time to start clearing the ring again. Austin threw out Test in 43:25. Bossman dumped X-Pac in 43:32. Owen Hart came in. Austin threw out Jarrett in 45:01. Austin threw a water pitcher in McMahon's face at ringside, but McMahon didn't come into the ring. Finally Chyna, as number 30 hit the ring, went after Henry and dumped him at 47:31. Austin then clotheslined Chyna over the top at 47:41. Helmsley threw out Venus in 48:42. Austin hit a stunner on Triple H and dumped him at 48:59, leaving Austin, Brown, Hart, and Bossman. Austin dumped Hart in 51:45. Brown hit a frog splash on Austin, but then Bossman dumped him at 52:15. Austin then dumped Bossman at 52:25. Austin then went after McMahon at ringside and threw him over the barricades into the crowd, then back over to the ringside area. Austin delivered a hard chair shot to the head. Austin was killing him until Vince hit a low blow. Austin sold it momentarily, recovered fully, and hit the stunner and a forearm off the middle rope. This brought Rock to ringside. Rock and Austin argued, allowing McMahon to dump him from behind to win. Probably the worst Rumble ever when it came to the wrestling, but they at least constructed some stories to the match. Star and a half. With one blowout and a closer but still solid victory, the World Wrestling Federation's Raw show has now topped Nitro 13 consecutive weeks in the Monday Night Ratings war. Raw captured all 8 quarters en route to a near-record 5.59 rating, 5.34 first hour, 5.83 seconds hour, and 8.3 share on January 18. Nitro did a 4.86 rating, 5.85 first hour, 4.52 seconds hour, 4.34 third hour, and 7.1 share. The head-to-head 2 hours and 4 minutes saw Raw at 5.58 and Nitro at 4.43, so the average head-to-head gap was more than 1 full ratings point. On January 25, Raw captured 5 of the 8 quarters and the overrun, scoring a 5.46 rating, 5.71 first hour, 5.21 seconds hour, and 8.1 share to Nitro's 4.99 rating, 5.28 first hour, 4.63 seconds hour, 5.07 third hour, and 7.3 share. The head-to-head 2 hours and 5 minutes saw Raw at 5.46 to Nitro's 4.85. There were definite winners and losers on January 25 and large viewer shifts, which Nitro relying more on longer matches and Raw on skits and interviews. Although Raw won, coming one day after a huge WWF pay-per-view and with Raw numbers declining as the show went on while Nitro's increased, and with Raw as the show with momentum and with both companies putting on good television shows for the most part, it can be called a slight victory for old-style wrestling. WCW attempted on January 18 the experiment of putting a main event at the end of the first hour, hoping for it to carry over past the hour so the large viewership switchover when Raw starts could be alleviated. Last week, due to a timing problem, the Bischoff vs. David Flair match and haircut ended just as Raw was starting, rather than carrying over, but still resulted in the closest Nitro would come as it did a 4.9 Jericho and Conan interviews to Raw's 5.1 Austin interview. Beginning of Road Dogg vs. Gangrel. On January 25, the timing was better but the result wasn't, as the Hall vs. Bigelow ladder match which carried over well past the hour fell from a 5.9 to a 4.6, while Raw opened with a McMahon discussion with Austin and Michaels doing a 5.8. As would be expected, Raw's Goldust vs. Gunn and Triple H interview at a 5.5 beat the Meng and Barbarian vs. Finlay and Taylor 4.6. Raw's biggest edge came when the in-ring confrontation between Rock and Mankind to build to their Super Bowl empty arena match did a 6.4 against a far too long Saturn vs. Smiley doing a 4.1. There was a turnaround as Hart vs. Booker T won its time slot at 5.15 to Droz vs. George Steele at 5.13, but that was quickly turned around as the Hart T finish did a 4.8 while WWF's tag title change with Jarrett and Hart beating Shamrock and Bossman, a 5.9. From there, WCW with Goldberg vs. Norton did a 5.5, beating Val Venus video and match with Test at 4.9. The hardcore match with Road Dogg and Snow vs. Gangrel and Edge did a 5.2, beating a Hogan Nash and Steiner interview at 4.8. The beginning of the Flair and Benoit and McMichael vs. Hogan and Nash and Steiner did a 5.1, beating a brief Undertaker segment, and the beginning of Rock vs. Triple H I Quit doing a 4.8, but the overrun, with the finish of Rock vs. Triple H against the finish of the six-man saw Raw score a 5.5 to 5.3 Edge. On January 18th after the first quarter, the closest thing Nitro had to a winning segment was a 4.8 for a Nash interview, which still lost handily to the 5.7 for Mankind vs. Bossman and the Mark Henry blowjob from the transvestite. Raw's biggest thrashing was a 6.1 for Snow vs. Goldust for the head, destroying Guerrero vs. Psychosis at 3.9. While WWF lost a sizable audience for the second Undertaker segment, it still beat Mysterio Jr. vs. Luger 5.3 to 4.3, and then Chyna vs. Patterson and Briscoe scored a 6.1 to beat the 4.2 for the post-match of Luger vs. Mysterio Jr. with the thrashing of Ray and Conan run-in and the ring intros to the Goldberg Hall Bigelow three-way, while the overrun of Rock vs. Kane beat the WCW three-way 6.0 to 5.3. Japanese television rundown. December 30th UFO. This show was a big improvement over the first show on October 24th. On the first card, it was like watching a bunch of non-workers from the fighting world like Kevin Rosier trying to work really bad pro wrestling matches. This time they had a better idea conceptually of what they were trying to do, and most of the matches were okay and some even quite good. 1. Tiger Mask beat Jason Press in 4:39 with a crossface submission. It's still so weird watching something that is supposed to be a shoot and have a fighter wearing a tiger mask during a match. Tiger did a lot of suplexes, punches and kick and ended with a crossface submission. 3 stars. 2. Orlando Vite beat Ikuto Hidaka in 6:15 with a series of low kicks setting up a high kick knockout. Hidaka took some stiff strikes to get it over as legit and Vite did a good job as well. 2 stars. 3. Lee Young Gun beat Kevin Carr with a front choke. Only clips aired and it didn't look good at all. It looked like a kung fu movie fight scene rather than a legitimate match. 4. Dave Beneteau beat Roby Peters with a triangle choke in 4:29. Real good intensity. Very surprising to see how well 2 non-workers did. 1.5 stars. 5. Igor Mindert beat Eric Ulrich in 6:01 with a rear naked choke. Only clips aired and they didn't look good. 6. Alexander Otsuka beat Satoru Sayama in 7:51 with a heel hook. This was easily the best match in the short history of the promotion. In the ring introductions, besides billing Sayama, who came out wearing a mask but removed it when the match started, as the father of Vale Tudo, they also referred to him as being 5'10". I thought that was hilarious until Monday night when Michael Buffer said Chris Benoit was 6'3". Even at 41, Sayama has quickness and reflexes like few in pro wrestling history. In fact, even to this day I've never seen anyone who could touch his quickness. Through savage kicks that Otsuka took. At one point Otsuka tried a heel hook and they rolled off the circular ring. They have ropes but there is more space on the apron than traditional boxing or wrestling because of the trademark circular ring. Sayama came back with all kinds of brutal kicks until Otsuka caught his heel again with a heel hook. Sayama rolled out of the ring again, but to get the new surface over, while he was outside but still on the mat, he couldn't break the hold and submitted. To get over the heel hook, Sayama was carried out of the ring. 3.5 stars. 7. Brian Johnston beat Vincent D'Acquetta in 3:20 with a shoulder lock submission. Johnston basically no-sold D'Acquetta and acted like a cocky pro wrestler doing a squash match. He showed more poise in doing so than you'd think. 8. Don Frye beat Kazunari Murakami in 10:10 with a choke. Solid match with Murakami on the offensive, getting a lot of near submissions. At the 5 minutes mark they did a false finish with Frye pounding and head-butting him from the mount, but Murakami made a great escape into a submission. Fry's glove got loosened and he started choking Kazunari with the glove strap, which got amazing heat after a night of traditional clean fighting. Murakami got a choke but Fry broke it by thumbing his eyes and then got a choke. 2 stars. 9. Naoya Ogawa beat Gerard Gordeau in 5:46 with a choke. Ogawa got a pop doing the Inoki crawl, which he used in the LE match. Basically nothing happened until Gordeau hit him with a low blow. Ogawa made a comeback and won. Really crummy main event. I don't think Gordeau has ever had a decent pro wrestling match in his life, but he seemingly lives forever whenever a Japanese wrestler wants a big win over a shooter off winning a big karate tournament in the mid-80s and going to the finals of the first UFC in 1993. Dud. January 10th All Japan. 1. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama captured the double tag titles from Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue in 25:58. The production values of this typing was 70s Kansas City level, which is amazing for a Japanese network broadcast as they didn't even do this stuff in the 60s. Probably a sign of cost cutting. Even with the poor lighting and only a 2-camera shoot, nothing could hide the quality of this match. It was what you'd expect with all three pretty much at peak level, and even Taue didn't hurt the match. Taue was a little off early, but by the end his timing and work was even good and it didn't hurt the match since Kawada was in most of the way. All the stiff moves and near falls, trading hard chops and kicks before finally Kobashi hit Taue with a lariat for the pin. 4.5 stars. Mexico. The January 28th lineup for Tijuana has Conan and La Parca and El Hijo del Santo versus Villano Tercero and Black Magic, Norman Smiley, and Silver King. A battle royal with Rey Mysterio Jr., Psicosis, Damien, Super Colo, Venom Black, Atlantis, Dandy and Tornado Negro, Lismark Sr. and Jr., although Jr. may miss the show due to his neck injury, versus Fuerza and Juventud Guerrera and prelims. There will be a major show on February 5th at Mexico City Arena Coliseo as the 15th anniversary of the death of El Santo. There will be a silver mask tournament, only open to heavyweights, as the main event, and to show the magnitude of this event, with the big news being the announcement that Pero Arguello would be working the show. Antonio Pena then sent out a press release saying that Arguello could attend the show to honor Santo, but couldn't wrestle on the show. Arguello, who turned 53 this past week and has worked a hard style his entire career, then called up Dr. Alfonso Morales' sports talk show and said that he was definitely going to retire this year and wanted his final match at Arena Mexico, saying he considered it the Cathedral of Lucha Libre. Most likely that will take place for the anniversary show in late September. This would be every bit the equivalent of Hogan calling up a talk show to announce his retirement. Oh yeah, he already did that. And saying he wanted his retirement match on a WWF show in Madison Square Garden. There had been rumors among the wrestlers that Arguello was looking at leaving AAA or PAP or whatever it's being called this week, but the problem was that he wanted to take care of his son, who is one of AAA's biggest stars. I don't know if that means he's going to wrestle on February 5th, or that he is, or when he will, be leaving PAP. The tournament was announced as having Arguello, Cien Caras, Rosso de Plata, Rayo de Jalisco Jr., Mascara Año 2000, Salomon Grundy Universo 2000 and Gran Marcus Jr. I mean, this sounds absolutely hideous. The January 22nd Arena Coliseo main event saw the trio of Blue, Black and White, Blue Panther and Black Warrior and Dr. Wagner Jr. retain their CMLL Trios titles, beating Atlantis and Emilio Charles Jr. and Felino when Wagner pinned Atlantis clean with the Michinoku Driver 2 in the third fall. The newspapers reported it as the best match at Arena Coliseo of the month. The January 29th Arena Coliseo show looks to be the weakest lineup so far this year, with Shocker and Mr. Niebla and Tinieblas Jr. versus Los Hermanos Dinamita on top. January 31st at the same building will be Archangel versus Astro Ray Jr. for the CMLL welterweight title. Astro Ray Jr. has pinned Archangel 5 different times in trios matches over the past month. Pena is now going with plans of running one major show per month. The January big show will be the Flip/Flop show, Heels Wrestle as Faces, etc. on January 31st, while the February big show will be called Reina de Reinas, which I believe means Queen of Queens, at El Toreo in Naucalpan. The Flip/Flop show is headlined by Octagon and Heavy Metal and Pero Arguello Jr. versus Pentagon and Sangre Chicana and Kickboxer, plus a hair versus hair match with AAA Mosco de la Merced versus Ray Dragon. The deal with that match is that both are masked men, but they are going to take the mask off and shave the head of the loser, but then he can wear his mask again. Dr. Alfonso Morales and Evacianes knocked Rey Mysterio Jr. for no showing his main event against Psicosis. He was replaced by Super Astro at the January 15th Tijuana show. The DF Commission has approved of Pena shows and he'll start back running in the Mexico City area on February 14th. EMLL Ref El Pompin recently had a party to celebrate 42 consecutive years working for the company. El Hijo del Santo's latest win in a mask versus mask match, and he must be nearing about 60 in a row, was on December 20th beat El Asterisco, who won masked as Enrique Silva, 33. There were some major problems before the PAPSA TV taping on January 16th in Cuernavaca. When Pena and his TV crew arrived at the building at 3:30 that afternoon, it was all locked up and they wouldn't let anyone in. This lasted for 3 hours. Apparently last year PAPSA ran a house show in the same building, and Pierre Roth Jr., who was working for Pena at the time, said he'd pay the rent and all building costs after the show, but he disappeared without paying after the show. So when Pena came to the building, the concessionaires and the union wanted their money from the last show. Pena apparently wasn't warned this would happen as the people had been after Pierre Roth for the money. They finally got enough money together to pay the due bills and were allowed in the building. Due to a combination of the big attendance at Arena Coliseo and the fact Arena Mexico hasn't drawn well in a long time, the difference is that Arena Mexico is in what has become a high-crime neighborhood. EMLL announced it was delaying moving the Friday night shows back to Arena Mexico. Traditionally it moves back the final Friday of January. All Japan. The other big story, besides the Kauta title win and broken arm, was that Vader did his first job in All Japan rings also on the January 22nd Osaka show, which was the final show of the current tour. It was in a 6-man tag, where Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama and Jinsei Shinzaki beat Vader and Yoshihiro Takayama and Masahito Kakihara, put together since all three worked together a few years ago in the old UWFI promotion, in 1152 when Kobashi pinned Vader after a lariat. The other major results on that show had Johnny Ace and Bart Gunn over Akira Taue and Tomoe Honda in 822 when Ace used the Johnny Spike on Honda, Takao Omori and Jun Izumida over Gary Albright and Monakia Mossman when Omori pinned Mossman after an axe bomber, a Hulk Hogan-style lariat. In 1031, and Yoshinari Ogawa pinned Johnny Smith with a back suplex in 1701. Giant Baba's 61st birthday on January 23 wasn't as big of a deal as it annually is with him still in the hospital. Baba was there with his wife, along with Ref Kyohei Wada and the All Japan ring announcer. Wada brought Baba the tape of the Misawa Kauta match and said Baba was watching it with a big smile on his face and thought it was a great match. There have been hints that if at all possible that Baba would come back at the Tokyo Dome show. Nothing more has been said about his condition. Apparently he was suffering from the illness in December and was hospitalized. He was released for about a week and underwent a checkup, at which point the doctors found that whatever it was they thought he didn't have that he still had and ordered the operation, and he's now recovering from the operation. He's still hooked up to N4 and not conducting any business, but insiders are saying the condition is not super serious. No deal has been made, but doors have been opened regarding opening of negotiations when Baba gets out of the hospital to perhaps use some WWF talent at the Dome show. January 17th TV show, which was the Kobashi Vader singles match, drew a 5.1 rating. New Japan. The new tour opens on January 27th. It will be interesting to see the status of Scott Norton. Norton, who is scheduled to work part of the tour including being Masa Saito's opponent in his retirement match on February 14th, was really upset at the way everything went down regarding his short IWGP title reign, and has told people that he's through with New Japan. Most of the news of the week continued to be headlined by fallout from the Shinya Hashimoto vs. Naoya Ogawa match. There has been a decent amount of mainstream pub, largely referring to this match as the night that pro wrestling became real. I don't believe one mainstream pub in Japan has hinted or suggested that it was, in part at least, an angle to get Ogawa over. One magazine article did quote both Ogawa and Satoru Sayama as saying that Hashimoto knew in advance they were going to do a Vale Tudo shoot match as opposed to a pro wrestling match, and that he prepared for it by rubbing oil all over his body, which allowed him to slip out of some of Ogawa's holds. This looked to be true. Hashimoto has not signed his 1999 contract with New Japan, although he appeared with President Seiji Sakaguchi and Booker Riki Choshu at a press conference. Choshu said that the match, Hashimoto vs. Ogawa, was good for the fans. Sakaguchi said he didn't think so, didn't want to work with UFO and wouldn't allow a rematch, angle alert. Choshu said that he wanted to book a rematch, but Sakaguchi said he was the president and wouldn't allow it, double angle alert. There have been hits the rematch will take place either on March 12th at the UFO show at Yokohama Arena, or on April 10th at the Tokyo Dome, or perhaps there will be at both, as there was talk of doing a best-of-3 series between the two. Don Frye issued a challenge to Keiji Muto for an IWGP title match, so expect that a major show soon. Tatsumi Fujinami also didn't sign his new contract and said that he wanted Choshu to come out of retirement to team with him to win the IWGP Tag Team titles. Tadao Yasuda will be replacing Hashimoto in the IWGP Heavyweight Title No. 1 Contenders Tournament, which starts on January 27, and he'll face Manabu Nakanishi in the first round. January 16 TV show did a 3.8 rating. Other Japan notes. Rings ended its Mega Battle Team tournament before 10,500 at Budokan Hall on January 23, which was also a live TV special, with Georgia beating Netherlands in the finals 3-2. Ram Zaza of Georgia beat Dick Frey in 122 by TKO. Joop Kasteel then beat Zaza with a choke in 322. Kasteel followed beating Bitsaid Amaran with a choke in 246. This left Bitsaid Teriel having to beat both Kasteel and Hansa Nyman, and he knocked both of them out to win it for his country. In the top undercard matches, Tsuyoshi Kosaka beat Kiyoshi Tamura in 9:22 with an armbar, and Volkan beat Hiromitsu Kanehara in 13:22 with an ankle lock. I'm presuming all of the above-mentioned matches were works, but haven't talked to anyone who saw the tape yet. There is a huge mystery as to why Teriel gets such a huge push. He's the group's world heavyweight champion. Since he has no charisma, is a huge but unimpressive-looking guy and isn't much in the ring. Japanese promotions like to build around Japanese trying to conquer huge foreign heels dating back to the days of Rikidozen facing Ben and Mike Sharp. With Anton Geesink in the news, it also occurred to me the physical similarities between Teriel and Geesink, who was an even worse performer than Teriel but was a huge star in Japan in the mid-70s for All Japan because he was a huge man who was an Olympic gold medalist in judo, a sport created in Japan, and Teriel is the same except his sport is karate, which is also Japanese-based. Alexander Karelin was in Japan this past week and things didn't go smoothly. There were several meetings with Akira Maeda, Karelin and the Soviets who control Karelin's business regarding the rules for the February 21 match. No rules were agreed upon and there is at least conjecture that the match is in jeopardy. Apparently the Soviets were under the impression this was going to be similar to their dealings with New Japan and UWFI when top Russian amateur stars, most notably Salman Hashimakov and Viktor Zangyev, went years back, and they were of the understanding that Karelin was going to do an exhibition pro wrestling match as opposed to whatever it is exactly is that they want this match to be. 3 more matches were announced for the February 21 show: Kanehara vs. Ricardo Moraes under Vale Tudo rules, as listed here last week, Tamura vs. Valentijn Overeem, the long-awaited rematch of their now famous match from last year where Overeem blitzed Tamura in a shoot, and another Vale Tudo rules match with Yasuhiro Namikawa vs. Tatsunori Kamiyama, the latter making his pro debut. Hikari Fukuoka, the current JWP champion, will be retiring shortly as she's engaged to be married. JWP President Masatoshi Yamamoto made the announcement this week, but didn't list a retirement date, only saying that they would book her in one more title match before her retirement. Fukuoka, who turns 28 next month, has been wrestling for 10 years, making her name first in 1994 largely because of her similarities to Manami Toyota, at the time the best woman wrestler in the world, and the two had some interpromotional singles matches that got her recognition. She suffered a pretty severe neck injury last year which may have also contributed to her retirement. Michinoku Pro had another press conference on January 23. It was announced that Grand Naniwa, Naohiro Hoshikawa and Masato Yakashiji, who were with Super Delphin at his press conference, were all finished with the company once their contracts expire at the end of February, and that they would try and take some disciplinary action against Masaru Seno, who was also at the Delphin press conference but whose contract doesn't expire shortly. Ted Tanabe, the ref, who held the press conference, also announced Great Sasuke would be suspended for 3 weeks and would not be allowed to talk with reporters because of the embarrassment he caused at the Delphin press conference. Apparently, and at least some of this is an angle and some isn't, Sasuke, who went public with Delphin leaving before any announcement was made to get over stronger as a heel, then came to the press conference for the same reason and started talking about Delphin's private life with women, his failed marriage and other topics considered off limits to talk about publicly in the Japanese wrestling world. Sasuke will be pulled from his New Japan bookings on February 5 and February 6 in Sapporo, and MPW will be sending Gran Hamada in his place. Sasuke, Hamada, Jinsei Shinzaki and Tiger Mask will be the only top stars left for MPW when it starts its next tour on March 13. Delphin will be running the promotion called Kakao, which in Japan is being billed as CMLL Japan, which starts on February 24. Ultimo Dragon held a press conference and announced that he would be having a business relationship with Michinoku Pro and that Sasuke would still appear in the NWA middleweight title tournament on February 7th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. FMW held a press conference regarding its February schedule. On February 18th in Hiroshima, Hiromichi Fuyuki defends the unified heavyweight title against Daisuke Ikeda. February 21st in Hakata has a singles match with Hayabusa vs. Mr. Ganasuke. That Gosaku has quit the promotion and that Hayabusa and Ikeda have vacated the Brass Knucks tag team titles, and they would be holding a tournament in March to determine new champions. Linus Asuka beat Kyoko Inoue on the January 24th JD show at Korakuen Hall to regain the TWF World title in 1859 after blowing the kabuki mist into Inoue's face. Asuka winning the title looks to set up the April 4th Asuka vs. Chigusa Nagao match as a double title match with JD's TWF World title against Gia belt. LLPW held a press conference on January 23 announcing a big show on March 10 at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym. This hasn't been announced, but it is believed the main event will be Shinobu Kondori defending the WWWA title against Yumiko Hata of AJW and Yasha Kurenai defends the All-Pacific title against Kumiko Maekawa. So it'll be both major AJW singles belts, which are held by LLPW wrestlers, being defended in interpromotional bouts on the LLPW show. It looks as though Genichiro Tenryu will wrestle Atsushi Onita either on March 1 at Korakuen Hall or 3/14 at Yokohama Bunka Gym. Yusuke Imegura, who was the 1998 Japanese Collegiate Freestyle Wrestling Champion at 187 pounds for Nippon College, will be joining the Takata Dojo after he graduates college in March. Imegura wants to do Vale Tudo matches but also train for the Sydney Olympics. Weekly Gong in the February 4th issue did a 2-page spread on the Wrestling Observer Awards, headlining with Steve Austin winning Wrestler of the Year and with the Misawa vs. Kobashi match as Match of the Year. Also with photos in the spread were Austin vs. McMahon, Tamura, Misawa vs. Kobashi, Goldberg, Sonny Wanu, Gracie vs. Takata and Foley. Weekly Pro Wrestling on February 2nd had an article about Sam Mushnick and it included a memo circa 1961 to 62 regarding money figures at the time. At the time, the NWA recognized 4 titles: the World Heavyweight title, held by Buddy Rogers, the United States title, held by Pat O'Connor, who was given the title when he lost the world title to Rogers at the famous Comiskey Park match since Rogers had held the U.S. title going into the match, the World Junior Heavyweight title, held by Danny Hodge, and the World Light Heavyweight title, held by Gory Guerrero. There were numerous other belts called NWA titles such as the middleweight and welterweight belts in Mexico, and different versions of NWA World Tag titles, but those weren't actually recognized at the time by the NWA office and were just regional belts. At the time, Rogers was to receive 11.25% of the after-tax gross, as opposed to the 8% the champions of the 70s received, and the NWA Treasury was to receive 3.75% of the after-tax gross as the NWA booking fee, later dropped to 3%. So in those days, booking a world title match meant giving up 15% of the house. The NWA also booked the U.S. champion at the time, and O'Connor was to receive 10% of the gross, but the NWA Treasury would book him but not take a booking fee. I guess with the idea of trying to get the belt exposed nationally, which didn't happen, and that version of the title didn't last much longer. The NWA office didn't book Hodge or Guerrero, and deals with them were to go through Leroy McGurk and Salvador Lutteroth with no set percentage. There was a clause that those figures weren't etched in stone, as it was agreed the champion's percentage could be lowered when special arrangements were made with the champion's booker, but that in those circumstances the champion should be paid at least 25% more than the challenger, unless it was considered a super or spectacular show, and in the opinion of the promoter, the challenger had as much drawing power as the champion. In that case, both men would be paid an equal amount. Some more names going to the World Pro Wrestling Promotion debut tour on January 31st include Minnesota Indies' Brad Kohler, who went to Japan first for the 1996 UFC Japan show, Derek Dukes, he of Mark Gastineau boxing fame, Scotty Z, Chi-Town Thug, and Hater, along with Jeff Mangles of New England Indies. It was officially announced that the main event on the next Pancrase pay-per-view show, which will be April 18th from Yokohama Bunka Gym, will be Guy Mesger vs. Semi Schultz. Schultz, who is 6'10.5" and because of his height is devastating standing with his knees, beat Mesger on TKO in a non-title match last year. They had a ceremony this past week where recently retired Cuddy Suzuki blew up all her wrestling ring costumes here and there. Jesse Ventura's media honeymoon in Minnesota is already starting to have cracks in the foundation. His appointee to head the Department of Natural Resources was pressured into resigning 6 days into his term after it was discovered he had received several hunting and fishing violations, fines and citations over the past 10 years. Ventura has also been criticized fairly heavily after complaining about having to pay registration fees for his 5-wave runners. In an interesting note, the judge who swore Ventura in as governor, Paul Magnuson, was the same judge who ruled in his favor in his lawsuit victory over Titan Sports. There is a major connection to the pro wrestling world in the big news story about how the bribery scandal in Salt Lake City landing the Olympics, which is considered the biggest corruption scandal in Olympic history. One of the 13 IOC members implicated in the scandal, in which they accepted payoffs in exchange for naming Salt Lake City as the host of the Winter Olympics in 2002, is former pro wrestler Antonius Geesink, Anton Geesink. Geesink, 64, won his first national judo championship at the age of 15 in the Netherlands in 1949. He captured his first world championship in 1961 and won the gold medal at the Tokyo Olympics in 1964. He debuted as a pro wrestler for All Japan in 1973 amidst great fanfare since he was the judo gold medalist in Tokyo. He is 6'7" and probably 320 pounds and was always in the main event, teaming with the likes of Baba, Jumbo Tsuruta and the Destroyer against all the greats of the day like Bruno Sammartino, Billy Robinson, the Funk's Harley Race, and Don Leo Jonathan. The novelty wore off after a few years because he was poor in the ring and had no charisma, like Terriel, and he faded out after a few years. Geesink was issued a warning by the IOC, as opposed to being either suspended and recommended for expulsion or resigned from the IOC like 9 of other 13 implicated, for taking a vacation with his wife and kids to 3 national parks on the tab of Richard Welch, valued at $6,000, and accepting a personal check for $5,000, which he said he believed was for the Anton Geesink Foundation, a non-profit organization which helps out educational programs in the Netherlands that bears his name but that he's actually not a part of. Geesink has claimed innocence and blamed Dutch Olympic officials for his problems. The A&E Andre the Giant bio did a 2.7 rating, not a 2.5 as listed last week. The replay did a 2.0, so the combined audience was one of the highest rated shows ever on the network. The rating for the debut of Roller Jam was a 1.7 and the Saturday afternoon replay did in 0.8. The numbers were considered a disappointment, although maybe they shouldn't have been because Nitro debuted at a 2.5 on a much stronger station and with a huge base audience, as this is starting from scratch with no base audience, although people involved with the show are trying to put a happy face on it because the show did do incredibly well with teenage males, drawing probably as many if not more than Thunder did the night before doing pro wrestling on a much stronger cable network, as 15% of the total audience was teenage boys, which is even a higher percentage than Raw, although first week really doesn't mean much because if they stay interested it's more important, but it does show the advertising of the new Derby seemed to hit teenagers more than older people who grew up on the old version. If that audience holds up for a few weeks, there is a chance for cult popularity, particularly of a female star. The adult audience was a disappointment. The network's regional appeal showed as well, as the 4 markets it would have figured to do the best because they were the 4 strongest markets for roller derby and roller games in the heyday. It did poorly, doing in 0.5 in New York, San Francisco and Los Angeles, and in 0.9 in Chicago. It did much better in southern markets that Nashville network traditionally caters to, and much better in smaller cities than big cities. It won its time slot on cable among males 12 to 34 and also 18 to 34, which is rare for a show on Nashville network. The show more than doubled the Dusty Rhodes Monster Truck show that had been doing in 0.7 in the same time slot. The first week really isn't a barometer of anything, as its staying power or growth is more important over the long run. Behind the scenes the reactions were more negative than positive, and budget cutting is starting already. Other good and bad news. The quality of the games is set to improve, starting with the one that airs on February 5th, and reports are the 2 one-hour games format that started taping last week is an improvement. They had their first shoot and this is no angle. Little Richard Brown, the only player in this game who was actually a star at it during its heyday, and who apparently had been fed up with the prima donna attitude of the new skaters, complaining that all the novice skaters thought they were experts and couldn't be told anything, was double-crossed on a spot by J.R. Widener. Brown responded by punching him in the face and jumping on his legs with an attempt to hurt him, and while he didn't break the leg, injured the leg enough that Widener is out for the rest of the season and Brown was suspended and may not be brought back. The games are said to have improved tremendously of late because they are playing with higher impact, so the blows look more real, and on the flip side, there have been more injuries. Several wrestlers from Music City Wrestling, including North American champ Colorado Kid, plus area vets, worked January 24th for NWA Florida in Winter Haven. Kid beat Greg Valentine to keep his title in the main event. Brian Blair and Steve Kieran beat Bart Sawyer and Recon Barry Buchanan of the WWS Truth Commission to keep the Florida Tag Team titles, and Dory Funk beat Barry Houston, who WWF is looking at because he's tall and can work, to keep the Florida title. Steve Nelson's only big show in 1999 will be on March 20th in Amarillo, featuring a light heavyweight tournament and 2 title matches, Evan Tanner defending the heavyweight title against Mike Cizik, and Eric Payne defending the lightweight title against Mark Cantu. The building they are running in will be torn down, so the rest of the Amarillo shows will have to be held at the old Amarillo Sports Arena of Dory Funk's senior fame, which only holds 2,000. Independent Wrestling World is running February 13th and February 14th in Hanover, Germany, with Michael Kovac, Ian Rotten, Ulf Herman, Adam Pearce, and Robbie Brookside. Inside Edition will be filming the January 30th New Dimension Wrestling show in Thomasville, North Carolina, as apparently they are going to be doing a feature with Chris Cruz, perhaps regarding the current direction of WWF Wrestling. On the January 23rd Memphis TV show, Ricky Morton returned. Tony Falk is now back to his Boy Tony gimmick he used many years ago in Dallas and Memphis, as a Boy George type. They will be holding a one-night tournament on January 29th to crown the first Power Pro Wrestling heavyweight champ at the New Daisy Theater in Memphis. First round brackets are Aaron O'Grady vs. Vic Grimes, Baldo vs. Kid Wicked, Streak vs. Mike Tierney, Bulldog Reigns vs. Coco Ware, Morton vs. Boy Tony, Jerry Lawler vs. Sean Stasiak, and Brian Christopher vs. Bill Dundee. Lawler and Stacy were acting like they weren't going to be at TV, but instead at a local golf course on location. Lawler invited Stasiak to come out and he'd stick a club somewhere, and Stacy, wearing a skimpy top, asked Stasiak to come out. Stasiak went to go to the golf course, but someone slashed the tire on his car. Lawler, who was at the studio, jumped him with a garbage can lid. Coco Ware also returned on TV beating Lance Jade. Lawler vs. Stasiak was the TV main, with Stasiak DQ'd for handcuffing Lawler to the ropes. He then went after Stacy and started kissing her. She at first resisted but started giving in. Lawler freaked out, and Dave Brown made a point of saying how Stacy wasn't resisting. Music City's fabulous February reunion show on February 5th in Nashville is headlined by Colorado Kid defending the North American title against Lawler. For whatever this is worth, there was an indie show that drew 600 fans on January 16th in Hackleburg, Alabama, which included Bob Armstrong. At the show, the ring announcer asked fans if they knew who Road Dogg in the WWF was, and there was a big pop. Then they asked if they knew who his father was, and there wasn't a peep. Rick Baseman, who started Sting and Ultimate Warrior as Power Team USA nearly 14 years ago, is running shows every Saturday night at his Extreme University gym in Mission Viejo, California. His listing of those he is representing, most of whom, but not all of whom, are in training to do pro wrestling, largely consists of named bodybuilders and Valley Tudo fighters, including Aaron Baker, pro bodybuilder who years ago worked for Vince McMahon's WBF, Mark Coleman, Chris Cormier, a top 10 Mr. Olympia finisher in recent years, Paul Dillett, a top 6 Olympia finisher the past few years who was backstage at the Royal Rumble and people's eyes were bugging out because this dude is the ultimate roid monster, Gary Goodridge, Mike Henderson, Suicide Kid, Tom Howard, the instructor, who wrestled in Mexico as KGB and will be at probably the next WWF camp, Mark Kerr, Hank Hill, a World's Strongest Man competitor, Chemo Rico McClinton, a top bodybuilding name, Justin McCulley, who has fought in rings, Andre Roberts, who has fought in both UFC and Extreme Challenge and done indie pro wrestling, Marco Ruiz, Boss Rutan, and Oleg Toktarov. The first show was January 23rd, and among those in attendance were Ken Shamrock, Ken Norton Sr., Alan Goes, and several bodybuilding stars. On January 30th they will have Christopher Daniels, along with the pro wrestling debuts of Dillett, McClinton, and Coleman. Dale Gagner is running his first show under the AWA banner. He had filed to use the name since Vern Gagne hadn't used it in years, but legal battles with Gagne held up starting for a while, and his first show will be a casino show on April 23rd in Bullhead City, Arizona. In Puerto Rico, the top feud continues to be Carlos Colon versus Ray Gonzalez for the Universal Belt. Colon regained the title for the 22nd time on January 6th, but it was stripped the next day because the commissioner ruled before the pin. Colon had hit the ref with a board and also hit Gonzalez, with the board leading to the pin. Dutch Mantle will be returning to align with Gonzalez. After Glamour Boy Shane won their IC title from Pierre Roth Jr. on December 20th, it was announced Pierre Roth regained the title in a fictitious match on January 1st in Boston. The January 20th Los Angeles Times ran a story about World Power Wrestling, which runs weekly Sunday shows in front of a few hundred fans at the Anaheim Marketplace. For info on Power Slam, the British magazine which had the Dynamite Kid interview reported on here last week, you can write to SW Publishing, P.O. Box 48, Lancashire, Lancs LA 14ZE, United Kingdom. They are selling back issues of that specific issue for £2.50. Bruno Sammartino worked as a television color commentator and Dominic DeNucci as special ref for the main event, Sid Vicious vs. Pitbull No. 2, on the January 22 United States Championship Wrestling show in Rostraver, Pennsylvania. Dan Mushnick, the son of Sam, was named Citizen of the Year on January 23 for Douglas County in Georgia. Mickey Duff, the famous boxing promoter from England who for years was listed as vice president of the WWF, whatever that actually meant, was inducted this past week into the Boxing Hall of Fame. Michael Krause and Matt Creamer will be starting All-Star Championship Wrestling as a regular monthly group out of Green Bay, Wisconsin starting February 19 at the Concert Cafe. For more info you can call 920-497-0343. MMA. At this point the 3/5 UFC pay-per-view show looks to be coming from Bay St. Louis, Mississippi at the 1,500-seat arena at Casino Magic. The most likely double main event will be Vitor Belfort vs. Guy Mezger and Gary Goodridge vs. Tank Abbott. A decision hasn't been made whether or not the Belfort vs. Mezger match will be for the middleweight title or not. It is considered exceedingly likely that Frank Shamrock will be stripped of the title and that he won't be returning to UFC. It's a typical pattern of people, from Gracie to Ken Shamrock to Don Fry to Maurice Smith, who make a name in UFC and then depart over the money issue. The April show that was originally scheduled for Japan won't be taking place in Japan if the finances weren't worked out. It is becoming increasingly evident that the idea of doing 9 events in 1999 is going to be a difficult schedule to maintain since it involves at least 3 dates this year expected to be filled by foreign promoters in Japan and Brazil. The plan for the heavyweight title is for it to be decided on May 7th, although there is no word on who Boss Rutan's opponent would be. A name that has been mentioned is Enson Inoue, since Inoue defeated Randy Couture outside of UFC a few weeks after Couture had been stripped of the title over a money dispute with his Raw team management, and thus would be the lineal heavyweight champion. UFC fighters Pat Miletic and Laverne Clark were both involved in boxing matches on January 20th on Monty Cox's first Extreme Boxing show, where he promotes shows that include both NHB-style fights and also pro boxing matches. Miletic won his pro boxing debut by a 4-round decision, while Clark, who actually makes his living as a pro boxer, scored a first-round TKO. In the NHB portion of the show, Travis Fulton became the first fighter in history to record a legitimate 50 wins, as opposed to the ridiculous records claimed by many Brazilians and others. Fulton scored a 38 seconds win, upping his record to 50-12-5, for a guy who has the worst ears you'll ever see and seems to fight as often as once a week. Sergio Battarelli's International Vale Tudo Championships on January 20th in Sao Paulo, Brazil was headlined by Vanderlei Silva, 9-2, knocking out Pancrace's Adrian Serrano in 22 seconds. Another Pancrace fighter, Jason Godzi, lost a controversial tap-out in 8-19 to Francisco Bueno. Godzi was caught in the netting they have on the ropes to keep fighters from falling to the floor, and Bueno threw several shots at him while tied up. Godzi's manager Phyllis Lee protested the finish, but Battarelli ruled that Godzi hadn't done anything to where it looked like he was going to win, that when he told Bueno to break that Bueno broke, and that the blows didn't directly lead to the finish. Carlos Barreto 8-1, 1-4-32 with a choke over American amateur wrestler Brandon Lee Hinkle, while the Pedro 16-4, best known in pro wrestling for a win in a shoot over Koji Kiao and a loss in a worked match to Keiji Muto, beat Sylvia Yordam via tap-out. There has been some controversy regarding the Boss Rutan vs. Tsuyoshi Kosaka match at the January 8th UFC show in regard to, in particular, the stand-up ordered by John McCarthy when Kosaka was striking effectively on Rutan from the ground. The stand-up rule is ambiguous and is always going to be controversial. McCarthy in the fighters' meeting said that if a fighter isn't working to either improve his position or going for a finish that he would stand the fighters up. By that interpretation of the rule, the stand was legit. However, since Kosaka was striking effectively in the position he was in, the stand-up allowed Rutan the chance to play to his strengths, standing fighting, where he scored the kick to the knee that changed the course of the match and led to his pulling out a win in a match that he was trailing in. Rule changes, including the elimination of referee stand-ups, have been talked about. Having seen enough shows without stand-ups, it's a step backwards in that you can have those struggles on the ground where one guy is caught in the guard and nothing is happening for minutes on end. McCarthy's judgment call did change the flow of that fight and very possibly change the outcome, which would be okay, except the stand-up itself was controversial since the action had hardly slowed down when he made the ruling. It would be great for the stand-up rule to be interpreted consistently from show to show, but judgment being what it is, that can never be foolproof either. Saw the Muscle and Fitness March issue, currently on the newsstands, story on Frank Shamrock. It was about extreme athletes and their training largely based around his Brazil match with John LeBay. In the story it talked about his background training under Ken Shamrock, who the story referred to as a former UFC superfight champion but not as a pro wrestler. We have unconfirmed reports that Dan Severn will return to shoot fighting with a match on February 2nd in Honolulu and another match on the ring's Free Fight Gala in Amsterdam on February 8th against Joop Casteel, who is at large, 265 to 270 pound, juiced-up striker with questionable stamina. Ring's rules with the frequent stand-ups and the smaller boxing ring would work to Casteel's advantage, and the Amsterdam fights usually wind up being one of the most brutal shows of the year. It's hard to believe Severn, past the age of 40, would take two fights in different parts of the world so closely together, although it isn't as if he hasn't done that before. ECW. The 321 Living Dangerously pay-per-view show will be coming from Asbury Park, New Jersey. It now appears Taz vs. Sabu for the title will be one of the main matches, with Rob Van Dam vs. Jerry Lynn, who returns this coming weekend, and something involving Super Crazy and Yoshihiro Tajiri again as potential show stealers. If Terry Funk recovers enough to shoot an angle or two beforehand, he'll wrestle Tommy Dreamer, but if not, it'll be saved for the next pay-per-view. Shane Douglas vs. Chris Condito and Dudley's vs. Public Enemy are also pretty much expected. The biggest show of the past week was the Detroit debut on January 23rd before 2,900 fans. The crowd reactions were said to be super, with the exception of the Public Enemy Dudley's angle, which didn't get over and was said to have been a mess due to Johnny Grunge not selling the 3D, which led to a breakdown. They did an angle where one-man Gang and Rod Price were beating up Balls Mahoney after Mahoney had pinned Price. Sabu did a run-in which led to a singles match with Gang. Gang juiced as Sabu used a spike a la Chic and eventually lost. Antifaz del Norte vs. Little Guido turned into a tag match with Nova and Tracy Smothers involved, with Nova and Antifaz winning. Douglas, in his new face role, said he was going to give the people what they wanted since they were chanting to see Francine's tits, and that she would come out naked. Before she could, Condito and Tammy Lynn Sitch stopped her, and Condito ended up laying Douglas out this week. PE and Dudley's had their brawl, which also included New Jack, and Jack was laid out. Sid's appearance saw a Chris Chetty vs. Amish Roadkill match where he ran in and destroyed both of them. Rob Van Dam kept the TV title, beating Ulf Herman in a match that wasn't particularly good due to Herman, and the main event was a three-way where Tommy Dreamer won over Lance Storm and Justin Credible. The other two shows saw a crowd of 1,300 in Grand Rapids, Michigan on January 21st and a crowd of 1,700 in Lansing, Michigan on January 22nd. They'll return to Michigan in May. The Tajiri vs. Crazy match was said to have stolen the show in Detroit. Although there were reports of Sid no-showing Lansing on January 22nd, he was actually never booked to appear except in Detroit this week. He will no-show at some point soon, it just hasn't happened yet. Tammy Lynn Bitch was scheduled to have her boob job on January 25th. She claimed that ECW advised her to have the surgery and helped her out financially to do so. There won't be another TV taping until February 12th in Queens. The weekend TV aired 3 matches from the January 16th ECW Arena show. Sid vs. Skull Von Crush went 214 and was exactly what you'd figure. Jeff Jones pretty well dropped doing the Val Venus delivery and was more doing an early 90s Paul E. Dangerously delivery. It was better, but still not good. They had a screw-up on the choke slam spot, and they only did 2 spots, as either Sid didn't pick him up high enough or Von Crush didn't jump up high enough, and tried to overcompensate and wound up going head over heels over the top through a table and really could have gotten hurt. Tammy Lynn Sitch in her first close-up looked like she hadn't slept one night during her entire hiatus. Crazy beat Tajiri in 7:47 with a spinning reverse DDT in a 3 3/4 stars match. It was a step above their pay-per-view match as they did one big move after another. It was kind of worked backwards since they did big moves early and then wrestling later, as opposed to saving the big moves to build to the finish. A lot of unique dives. The Taz vs. Shane title match was okay, but nowhere close to its hype. It wasn't much better than an ordinary match, but Douglas' pre-match interview got the crowd going and the crowd made the match. Most of this classic wrestling match was 10 minutes of brawling around the building and even into the parking, but they both worked hard and the brawling was good. Joey Styles sold the spot where Douglas hit Taz with his cast a lot more than Douglas did. They were in the ring only 3 minutes before Taz put on his move. Douglas used the cast to break it, and then Taz suplexed Douglas through a table for the pin. Styles tried to sell it like it was a classic world title match. The difference these days between ECW announcing and WCW announcing is Styles is out there trying to make good matches seem like classics, even when they don't come close. In WCW, when they have spectacular matches as they often do, because they never involve the main eventers or rarely have storyline purpose, nobody does, can or tries to sell them as spectacular matches, so the minute they are over they are forgotten. The only time WCW sells a match as a great one is if it involves Page on pay-per-view, where he tries to get his match sold after the fact as if it was the greatest match in the history of the company, or if they try and oversell a bad Hogan match to sell the replay show, but nobody ever takes that seriously to begin with. At that ECW Arena show at 7:15 p.m. before the show they started turning fans away. Then at 7:30 p.m. they started selling $10 tickets for standing room, but telling people there was no guarantee if you buy the ticket that you would be able to see anything. WCW Nitro on January 25th from Reunion Arena in Dallas drew a sellout 16,014, 15,013 paying $396,030. The first hour was weak, largely revolving around segments with the black and white, which were cute on Thursday but got old on this show. It was funny as Stevie Ray and Curt Hennig were trying to rile up the other members who were still trying to kiss Hogan's ass. The inside humor, not about the individuals, but about the business, was priceless. Ray was acting like he'd had it and was going to tell the stars off. Then when he got to them, he double-crossed them all and was kissing up to them, no doubt an offshoot of the Patterson-Briscoe segment on Raw a few weeks back when McMahon showed up and Shane was running the show, and basically stooged Hennig off. The Wolfpack guys were trying to act too cool, getting out of their Learjet saying it was time to trim the fat, and they all beat up Hennig. Bryan Adams said that Hennig was like a brother to him, and then he was the first guy to turn on Hennig and join in. Flair sent Bischoff to work at the concession stand. The similarities between Bischoff and McMahon were amazing, as now Bischoff is using a TV show watched by millions to be his psychiatric release. As he was complaining about internal audits, WCW is in the midst of an internal audit and disappearing money. The only wrestling in the first 45 minutes was Disco Inferno over Al Green with a stunner in 2:53. Bam Bam Bigelow talked about being extreme and hardcore and challenged Scott Hall to the ladder match. The NWO was in their dressing room acting too cool. Ric Flair did an interview, saying that Bret Hart would be defending the world title at Super Brawl. He meant to say U.S. title, presumably against Sting, and that he'd have a non-title match against Booker T later in the show. Of course, that had been announced 2 segments earlier. Hall vs. Bigelow went 14:04 in the ladder match with the taser hung from the ceiling. It was a good match, but nowhere close to Hall vs. Goldberg. Bigelow did a diving headbutt from high on the ladder. Hall did an elbow drop off the ladder. Bigelow did a back suplex off the ladder. Bigelow got the taser but was hit with a low blow. Bigelow still grabbed it first, but Disco gave Hall another one, so they had dueling tasers. Goldberg ran in and cleaned house on both, zapping both guys. Scott Norton jumped Goldberg after the match. Hart returned in a pre-taped interview where he actually was given a topic to talk about. Meng and Barbarian beat David Finlay and David Taylor in 7:29 when Barbarian pinned Taylor after a powerbomb in the tag title tournament. To prevent NWO interference, Flair stationed a zillion WCW wrestlers at ringside. Perry Saturn beat Norman Smiley in 10:47 with a Death Valley driver. Way too long and not that good. The lowlight was when Smiley got behind Saturn, who went over, and went to lift his dress. I was afraid we were actually going to see somebody toss someone's salad, as Conan has been threatening. Hart pinned T in 15:35 of a non-title match. It was an old-style match. Hart was missing something. I was surprised they went so long with competitive TV and short attention spans, but the match was better than average. Goldberg pinned Norton with a spear and jackhammer in 5:32. Black and White ran in, but Goldberg cleaned house on all of them as well. The match fell apart near the end. After Goldberg cleaned house, Herschel Walker, Bret Hall, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Chuck Norris all hit the ring. Van Damme, when all 4 were introduced to the live crowd before the angle, got the biggest pop. Finally, Flair and Chris Benoit and Steve McMichael beat Hogan and Nash and Scott Steiner in 17:58 via DQ. Benoit worked almost the entire match and did a real good job. He even made Hogan look like a decent worker and made Big Papa Pump look like the old Scott Steiner. Both this match and the Hart match actually went longer than booked because in both cases, the show was running short and they had to add minutes. Flair finally made the hot tag and had Hogan in the figure 4 when Bischoff gave Nash a stick which he broke on Flair. McMichael was almost never in. It looked so entirely out of place in these main event angles as he hasn't improved and has gotten totally out of shape. The NWO ran in to attack the Horsemen, but literally everyone from WCW ran in for a wild brawl at the end. As the NWO guys ran off, they were met at the top of the stage by Goldberg, who picked them off one by one. They sure were trying to reposition Goldberg, and from the crowd reaction, it appeared the WWF Gillberg thing was starting to backfire as Goldberg got the reaction he used to get a few months back. In the Nash and Luger vs. Conan and Mysterio Jr. match at Super Brawl, if it winds up as a tag, it could be a single with Luger vs. Mysterio Jr. It'll be Luger's hair possibly up against Mysterio Jr.'s mask definitely. Unlike in 1997 when Bischoff wanted Mysterio Jr. to unmask and it became a huge issue, which resulted in just about the greatest singles match of the decade in this company, it is no longer a huge issue as Mysterio Jr. trusts that Nash, who is in complete control of just about every angle with the exception of Hogan's and probably Savage's when he comes back, will take care of him. Not much to report on as it regarded the WCW Saturday night tapings on January 19th in Dayton. They had a lucha match with Juventud Guerrera and La Parka and Silver King over Super Colo and Lizmark Jr. and Hector Garza that was the highlight of the first show on January 23rd. Lizmark Jr. injured his neck on a dive and eventually got up and continued the match and hurt himself again. And he was also injured blowing out his knee against Norton because Norton wasn't taking care of him while he was throwing him around. The other injury, all of which aired on January 23rd almost one after another, was to Prince Iaukea, who was knocked silly and had his head split open by a stiff kick from Jerry Flynn. They went right to the finish early because Iaukea was woozy. The highlight for the show that airs on January 30th was a triple count out in a triangle with Kidman, Rey Mysterio Jr., and Psicosis. Disciple was also back beating Lodi in a squash. Flair vs. Hart was scheduled as the dark match main event, but it wound up with Hart not there being Flair beating Horace Hogan. Elliot Murnick, who has been promoting house shows in the Carolinas dating back to the 70s for Jim Crockett Jr., had a triple bypass operation. They found out that unbeknownst to him over the past year or so, he'd suffered 2 heart attacks. On television this week, WCW mentioned both Murnick's surgery and that Gordon Nelson had suffered a stroke. Nothing new regarding Chris Jericho. Thunder on January 19th in Indianapolis drew 10,390 fans, or 8,923 paying $234,850. Show drew a 4.16 rating and 6.35 share. Most of the show was built around the NWOB team complaining about being the second team and how they weren't going to put up with it. They changed Vincent's name to Vince, and as a spoof of McMahon, had him gag while drinking raw eggs that were in the locker room. The main event was scheduled as Flair and Benoit and McMichael vs. Hennig and Vince and Norton, but Hennig no-showed not only this show, but all his weekend bookings against Benoit as well. He instead competed in the Buckmasters Deer Hunting Classic in Whitehall, Alabama along with Rick Steiner and Ray Traylor. Disco beat Flynn in 5:17 with the stunner. Flynn looked real good in this match. Horseman showed up in the NWO limo. Horace Hogan went to greet them and they all beat him up. Flair did a damn good interview talking about his match with Hogan and that he was redoing the tag team tournament since the Outsiders had screwed it up. So they stopped a screwed-up tourney and replaced it with another screwed-up tourney with no explanation as to who was in it, other than it would be a double elimination and the finals would be at Super Brawl. Saturn beat Al Green in 2:49 with the DVD. Saturn wore a new dress. Kenny Chaos beat Glacier in 3:39 with a springboard clothesline. Booker T beat Smiley via count out when Smiley simply left the ring at 10:01. Not good. In a tag tourney match, Bryan Adams and Horace Hogan had a miracle pulled on them by Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Kidman as they had a good match. Chavo and Kidman looked nothing short of great in both selling and making comebacks around 2 much bigger slugs. So naturally those two are being groomed for a split-up, Chavo going heel. Finish saw Vince hit Kidman with a slapjack and Adams pinned him in 9:22. Ray got mad at Vince for stealing his slapjack. Mysterio Jr. pinned Parka in 4:18 in a great match. DDP tried to do an out-of-character interview that didn't get over. Flair and Benoit and McMichael beat Ray and Vince and Norton in 4:07 when Flair putting the figure 4 on Vince. In matches for the next Thunder, it was Hugh Morris over Psicosis, Jericho over Silver King with a Lion Tamer, Finlay over Colo with a new submission move, Hall and Nash beat Mike Enos and Bobby Duncombe Jr. Disco, who suffered a foot injury, beat Garza. Bigelow destroyed Kaz Hayashi and the main event was a 16 minutes long match where Conan and Mysterio Jr. beat Hall and Nash via DQ. There has been talk about trying to turn Bigelow and Norton babyface. House shows this week saw the Saturday night taping January 19th in Dayton drew a sellout 3,643 paying $74,253. January 20th in Frankfort, Kentucky drew 1,499, paying $35,940 in one of the worst house shows from a business standpoint of the past 2 years, headlined by Flair vs. Hall. January 22nd in Peoria drew 6,155, paying $144,645. January 23rd in Jackson, Mississippi drew a sellout 8,007, paying $183,280, and January 24th in College Station, Texas drew 5,946, paying $125,085. Sting over Hart was the main event for Jackson and College Station, while Flair vs. Hall headlined Peoria. We don't have complete merchandise figures as we haven't gotten the Dallas numbers, but for the shows from January 17th through January 24th, the merchandise totals were $347,212 or $6.87 per head. Sting should be returning on television in the next week or two. The CBS Morning Show will be doing a 5-part segment on pro wrestling during February sweeps. Basically, the producer, Jose Diaz-Balcourt, was doing a Plimpton K gimmick. He was training under Randy Savage in Tampa, and the segment ends with him doing a wrestling match with Canyon in Jackson, Mississippi. Savage's gorgeous George Valet will be all over the segments. Paige was scheduled for NBC's Later on January 26th and Regis and Kathy Lee on January 27th. Goldberg is scheduled for Jay Leno on February 11th. Both Maxim and Forbes magazines are doing wrestling stories over the next few months, as well as Playboy doing its feature on wrestling. Several WCW wrestlers taped a segment for NTV on January 23rd in Big Bear, California, which is a battle royal that airs on February 7th. Larry Zbyszko, rocker Rob Zombie, and Jimmy Hart did the announcing. Zbyszko uttered his line of the year when introduced to Zombie, saying the last time he worked with a zombie was when he wrestled Dusty Rhodes. Bryan Adams won a battle royal which included Conan, Wrath, Kidman, Booker T, and Disco Inferno. Conan dressed up as a security guard and jumped him after the match when they were going to present him with his trophy. Ralphus is actually one of the guys who drives the ring from city to city and gets $200 extra for appearing on television tapings. Very little is confirmed for the January 27th Waco, Texas taping of the Telemundo pilot. It appears Paco Alonso won't allow his wrestlers to work with WCW, which screws up a lot of original plans. Conan tried to contact Antonio Pena for wrestlers, but Pena wouldn't work with him. Among those backstage at Nitro, besides athletes from every sports team in town, were Killer Carl Cox, Red Bastian, and Ray Thunder Stern. They are doing an angle where Alex Wright continually no-shows to build up his return with his new Aryan gimmick. Some updates on David Fleer. He actually is 19, just sometimes tells people he's older. He is now interested in becoming a wrestler and may start training this summer. He was never an amateur wrestler as they were making it out on television, unlike his father and his brother. New York Times critic Anita Gates reviewed an episode of WCW Saturday Night. She wrote that shows like World's Wildest Police Videos and Pro Wrestling are coveted by advertisers because they reach males 18 to 34 that have money to spend, haven't developed the spending patterns that are had to break like folks 35 and older have, and don't watch a lot of television. The episode she reviewed was the one a few weeks back on Goldberg. To show how closely she watched it, she described Goldberg as a 300-pound-plus wrestler with stringy hair, wearing a one-piece spandex ensemble in an orange and black print. We're figuring she got Goldberg confused with Paige, which would be hard since she talked about Goldberg ending the show beating Hogan. Stu and Helen Hart won't be losing their family home after all. The developer pulled out of the deal and the house will remain with the family. Selling the land near the house still remains an issue. The January 24th Calgary Sun ran an article with a photo of Stu with Bruce, Ross, Ellie Harry, Davey Boy Smith's son, and Diana. The story said that Rosaline Hedinger, president of the Alberta Historical Preservation and Rebuilding Society, wants to declare the house an historical site. The Hart House, before being bought by Stu Hart in 1951, the 22-room home which also houses 8 dogs and 7 cats, built in 1903, was owned by Edward Crandall, a former city alderman and later by an area judge. Hedinger said that both the Crandall and Hart families have played an important role in Calgary history. Major shows in March and April: 3-1 Nitro from the Dean Smith Center in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 3-half Saturday night taping in Rock Hill, South Carolina, 3/4 Thunder in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 3/7 house show in Rochester, New York, 3/8 Nitro in Worcester, Massachusetts, 3/14 uncensored pay-per-view in Louisville, 3/15 Nitro in Cincinnati, 3/16 Saturday night taping in Toledo, 3/18 Thunder in Lexington, Kentucky, 3/19 house show in Chicago, Hogan vs. Flair, 320 House Show in Milwaukee, Hogan vs. Flair, 322 Nitro at Club La Vela in Panama City for the annual Spring Breakout Nitro, 327 House Show at the Palace in Auburn Hills, Hogan vs. Flair, 329 Nitro in Toronto at Air Canada Centre, 330 Saturday Night Taping in Kitchener, ONT 331 House Show in Baltimore, April 1st Thunder in Richmond, Virginia, April 2nd House Show in Fairfax, Virginia, April 3rd House Show in Boston at Fleet Center, Hogan vs. Flair, April 5th Nitro in Las Vegas, April 11th Spring Stampede Pay-Per-View in Tacoma, Washington at the Dome, April 12th Nitro in Yakima, Washington, April 13th Saturday Night Taping in Boise, Idaho, April 15th Thunder in Orlando, April 16th House Show at Miami Arena, April 18th House Show in Tampa at Ice Palace, April 19th Nitro at O'Connell Center in Gainesville, Florida, April 23rd House Show in Chattanooga, April 25th House Show in Minneapolis at Target Center, April 26th Nitro in Fargo, North Dakota at the Dome, April 27th Saturday Night Tapings in Bismarck, North Dakota, April 28th House Show in Pittsburgh, April 29th Thunder at Penn State University and April 30th House Show at Nassau Coliseum. Ratings for the past 2 weeks saw Thunder on January 14th do a 3.89, WCW Saturday Night on January 16th do a 2.1 and WCW Saturday Night on January 23rd do a 2.5. WWF. Working idea for the February 14th Memphis pay-per-view is McMahon vs. Austin cage match, Rock vs. Triple H for the WWF title, Shamrock vs. Billy Gunn vs. Val Venus in a triangle match for the IC title, Jeff Jarrett and Owen Hart vs. Big Boss Man and Test for the tag titles, Road Dogg vs. Al Snow for the hardcore title, X-Pac vs. Kane, Gillberg vs. Christian for the light heavyweight title, so they'll get that belt off him, and Too Much vs. Scorpio and Bob Holly. It still wouldn't surprise me to see them do a fluke finish where McMahon wins again, so it ends up with McMahon vs. Austin at Mania with grandiose stips. How about Austin retires if he loses and Shane McMahon can never do wrestling announcing again if Vince loses, and do another Rock vs. Mankind match for the title because it's easy to see in some form or fashion they want to do something real big on the halftime heat, whether it be a Mankind injury or a title switch, and save Rock vs. Austin for the title for SummerSlam. The show is already sold out to the tune of 16,610 tickets for $292,449. The Winnipeg situation remained in the news over the past week. WWF Canada President Carl DeMarco set up a program where WWF wrestlers would speak to kids in Winnipeg called the Get It program to tell them what they do on television is performing, and they'd never behave that way in real life. WWF and TSN also volunteered to run public service announcements during the Raw broadcast, basically giving the same message that these antics are for entertainment purposes and not how people behave in real life. TSN, on its own, also edited both the Mark Henry angle, which nearly everyone in the WWF appears to have conceded was a mistake, and the spot where Chyna was molested by Patterson and Briscoe off the show last week. Later in the week, Lori Johnson, chairwoman of the Winnipeg School Division Trustees, put a damper on the idea, saying, "We're not interested in helping the WWF improve their public image. You can't come in and say, stay in school, don't do drugs, and now we're the good guys." Johnson said the school board is hard and fast in their attempt to get Raw moved to an 11 p.m. or later time start. It airs from 8 to 10 p.m. in Winnipeg, so kids won't be as apt to watch. Something has happened of late as the WWF local Winnipeg promoter, Bob Holliday, refused to be interviewed on the story. Calls to the WWF office in Connecticut went unanswered, and DeMarco would only consider being interviewed for the story if questions were submitted to him in advance, which is generally considered unethical in journalism, not that it doesn't happen, so as we've noted there appears to be some mysterious heat on this subject coming from somewhere. Don Callis, Jackal, who is technically still under contract to WWF although it ends in 2 weeks, noted that whenever it's moved, kids can still program VCRs, although it would still cut down on viewing greatly, and would send parents more of a message based on the time slot the show would air, and said WWF's prime audience is ages 17 to 34. If the latter was the case, I don't think this would even be an issue. But it's not. The highest rated age group for Raw is teenagers, and kids aren't that far behind. While I don't think there's anything a 17-year-old hasn't seen or heard, although it's doubtful that many people under 30 have heard of Saltpeter, I question some of the skits for 13-year-olds, let alone 5-year-olds, and the argument about doing the risque stuff in the second hour sounds nice, but it's BS because there is no decline in under 12 viewing generally even into the final quarter hour. Raw on January 25th from the America West Arena in Phoenix drew a sellout 13,538 paying $274,710 and another $104,239 in merchandise or $7.47 per. The show opened with McMahon doing an interview saying he was giving up his title shot but would appoint someone of his choosing to the Mania match. McMahon said he was going to give Rock the $100,000 from Shane's trust fund, Shane of course not looking very happy about it, for distracting Austin in the Rumble. Austin then was on the Titantron from Shawn Michaels' house in San Antonio, saying he blew it. Michaels announced that since McMahon gave up his shot, he's giving it to Austin since Austin finished second. Austin then put that shot up to get a cage match with McMahon in Memphis. Triple H did an interview challenging Rock to an I Quit match for the title on the show. Billy Gunn pinned Goldust after a piledriver in 159. During the match, Blue Meanie, came out and stole head. Mankind attacked the security guard and stole the $100,000. He started throwing bills into the crowd. The aura was blown when close-ups revealed they were all $1998'S, and said he'd throw all the money in unless Rock agreed to an empty arena match at halftime of the big game. They never used the word Super Bowl. Droz pinned George Steele in 46 seconds and was beating him up after the match until the Oddities made the save. Something must be up with ICP because the Oddities came out to a remix of the original song with new vocals. Gerald Briscoe and Pat Patterson tried to get Ken Shamrock and Big Boss Man to drink saltpeter, which is what they used to give soldiers in the wars to keep them from getting too horny. Mark Henry then came on to Deborah Hart and Jarrett won the tag titles from Shamrock and Bossman in 438. Deborah took off her jacket revealing her black bra, but neither Bossman nor Shamrock cared since they drank the magic potion. However, a new blue blazer ran in and hit Shamrock with a guitar and Owens scored the pin. The new blazer appeared to have been Coco Ware. Shane, Patterson and Briscoe came out and said Kane had apologized for what he did the previous week. Shane made him apologize twice, then apologize a third time on one knee. He wanted him to get on both knees when X-Pac came out and invited Kane to join DX. They bleeped out something X-Pac said. Kane choke slammed X-Pac and Shane gave him the Bronco ride. DX beat up Patterson and Briscoe during the commercial. Seriously, can anyone even tell the difference between Shane and Eric anymore? Terry Runnels asked D'Lo Brown to buy her tampons. Brown is a good actor, but this was beyond silly. I've seen guys buy this stuff for their wives and girlfriends every week and nobody is embarrassed by it. Val Venus did a shower scene with Shamrock's sister, who they're naming Ryan. Shamrock actually has a son by that name. Venus wrestled Test, but Shamrock cracked a chair on him to lead to the meltdown for the pin in 124. Billy Gunn made the save, but Venus thought Gunn hit him with a chair, so Venus attacked him. In a hardcore match, Road Dogg and Snow beat Gangrel and Edge in 7-11. The entire match was outside the ring, most of it backstage. They did a lot of nice sounding shots with light weaponry. Blue Dust gave Snow the head back. All four went through a table and Dogg pinned Gangrel. Dogg and Snow celebrated in the ring and Snow challenged Dogg for a hardcore title match. They went into the women's bathroom backstage and Godfather's hose ran out. Undertaker did a very short segment, which was enough to take a half point away over the quarter hour. Mabel is with his ministry. Somebody explain Mabel to me. Are they trying to kill Undertaker's career? They buried Vader underground, and he was infinitely more talented and in infinitely better condition, doesn't have a rep for hurting people, and was a big money player as opposed to a gigantic flop when he was given the ball. This guy couldn't even draw heat or even have a dud match with Mick Foley at the peak of Foley's popularity. Seriously, they should have brought back Sid or Ahmed Johnson way before this clown. Not to mention how silly, not to mention useless it is to bring in another near giant when Paul White is coming next month, and it isn't as if the WWF's weakest point is all those big guys except Kane and Undertaker, who are at least over even if they rarely have good matches anymore. Rock beat Triple H in 909 to keep the title in the I Quit match. Rock took a lot of bumps here, selling almost the entire way and even bleeding from the mouth. It was a real good match. Michael Cole talked about Rock coming back from a 40 minutes match the night before. I always wonder why the need to lie when the truth is impressive enough. Rock did a corporate elbow using the hammer on the ring bell. Triple H came back with a pedigree on the floor and teased a pedigree on the table. Kane ran in with the corporation and had Chyna up for the choke slam. They said unless Triple H quit that Kane would choke slam Chyna, so he quit. That should have just about everyone convinced they'll never see a finish and I Quit match in the WWF. Chyna then showed her appreciation by giving Triple H a low blow and joining the corporation. Maybe she'll explain that Vince paid for her new face and her new boobs and let her wear makeup, and when she was with Triple H, Everyone thought she was Sid Audi's little brother in drag. After the show ended, they taped most of the Heat show for Super Bowl Sunday. They had some sort of a confrontation with Triple H and China. They set up an X-Pac vs. Shane McMahon match for the Raw tape January 26th in Tucson that airs on February 1st. Bossman beat Jarrett and Shamrock beat Hart in singles matches and Undertaker beat Rock via DQ and Team Corporate interfered, which may have been a dark match since Rock vs. Mankind is airing on the show when halftime starts for 20 minutes in a pre-taped segment to give them a chance to edit it down to fit the halftime hole. Whoever came up with the idea of doing a world title match at halftime of the Super Bowl deserves a pat on the back, or a thank you, or a raise, or vacation time, or whatever they give people who come up with brilliant ideas in that company. The WWF entrance music album was up to number 41 on the charts this past week, selling 35,862 copies, and it was still climbing. WWF is now going to have to tear down the old Debbie Reynolds Hotel and put a new structure up on the site, as the current hotel wasn't structured in a way where they could set up an arena to tape television out of. Thrasher of the Headbangers had his knee surgery on January 18th. There are reports that an ad appeared in the Philadelphia market before Rumble listing Rock as champ. With the success of the last TV Guide wrestling cover, which sold 300,000 more copies than their average, they're looking at doing another 4-cover set in March to push Mania. February 7th and Madison Square Garden has been changed again, this time from Austin and Mankind vs. Rock and Kane, to Austin vs. Bossman, Rock vs. Kane, and Triple H and Outlaws vs. Undertaker and Bradshaw and Farouk. Major April dates are April 10th House Show in Cincinnati, April 11th Heat in East Lansing, Michigan, April 12th Raw in Detroit at Joe Louis Arena, April 13th Raw in Grand Rapids, Michigan, April 15th in Seattle, April 16th in Vancouver, April 23rd in Toronto, April 24th in Madison Square Garden, April 25th Redemption Pay-Per-View in Providence, April 26th Raw in Hartford, and April 27th Raw in New Haven. Some other major dates after that are May 1st in Anaheim, May 2nd in San Diego, May 9th Heat in Jacksonville, May 10th Raw in Orlando, May 11th Raw in Fort Lauderdale, May 23rd Pay-Per-View in Kansas City, May 24th Raw in St. Louis, and May 25th Raw in Moline, June 7th Heat in Boston, June 8th Raw in Worcester, June 27th King of the Ring in Greensboro, June 28th Raw in Charlotte, June 29th Raw in Fayetteville. In the January 30th Billboard magazine video charts, under the heading of Sports Videos, WWF held the first 8 spots, Austin at 1 and 2, Foley at 3, Sable at 4, Best of Survivor Series at 5, Undertaker at 6, Best of Mania at 7 and DX at 8, plus the Ventura tape was at 13, 1998 Royal Rumble at 14, WrestleMania 14 at 17, and WWF Mayhem in Manchester at 20. WCW Sting tape was at number 12. The rest were a bunch of lame-ass guys who probably don't even know the meaning of the word sports, entertainers like Jordan, the Chicago Bulls, more Jordan, the NBA playoffs, more Jordan, and a couple of Yankees videos. A correction on the background of WWF writer Ed Ferreira. Ferreira was a wrestling fan for a long time and even wrestled independently in Southern California under the name Beautiful Bruce Bodine for the Slammers Wrestling Federation while writing and producing the USA Network show Weird Science. WWF has gotten a ton of pub regarding the Super Bowl commercial, including a story in the January 25th New York Times. WWF will be starting a multi-million-dollar ad campaign to go after its media detractors and for image enhancement. The commercial, titled A Day at the Office, combines stuntmen and special effects along with WWF wrestlers, as a supposed tour of Titan Towers. The commercial starts with Austin talking about wrestling as being non-violent entertainment, and then he hits someone with a chair. Sable then says they would never use sex to enhance the image, and walks past a couple making out. Rock, Undertaker, and Mankind talk about being positive role models and being wholesome family entertainment, while behind them are fires, brawls, and a melee in the lobby, ending with an explosion that sends a man through a window, ending with McMahon saying those magic words in the camera, "Get it." Despite rumors to the contrary, the other advertisers on the Super Bowl didn't complain about being placed with the WWF, nor was WWF asked to pay more than the $1.6 million list price for its 30-second ad, which could have been charged had the commercial contained sensitive content. The ad will air during the third quarter. The next Puerto Rico shows will be February 11th in Carolina and February 12th in Ponce with Dick Togo, Takamichi Noku, DOA, New Age Outlaws, Val Venus, Gangrel Luna, Jacqueline, Huracan Castillo, Miguel Perez, Ricky Ramirez, Al Snow, Reckless Youth, Savio Vega, Bulldust, and El Hijo del Santo announced. They are tentatively scheduling shows on May 15th to May 17th, with Austin and Undertaker. For January 15th to 16, Livewire did a 1.7, Superstars a 1.8 and Heat did a 3.85. For January 22nd to 23, Livewire did a 2.2, Superstars a 2.1 and Heat a 4.77. The Reader's Pages. Mushnick. Your recent article on the late Sam Mushnick was outstanding and it brought back some great memories. Growing up in Florida during the territory's heyday, you always knew when Mushnick appeared on television that something big was going to happen, usually to hype a world title match with Dory Funk Jr. or Jack Briscoe. To me, he was a great wrestling promoter and not just some guy backed by one of the biggest media conglomerates in the world or someone who has taken wrestling to prime-time borderline smut. Dave Flaherty. Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'm watching Thunder as I write this. Am I ever tired of the taser and 20-man run-ins? I know I'm stuck in the past, but this is pathetic. Your Sam Mushnick obituary was a classic story about a true wrestling classic. We'll never have another promoter like him in the wrestling business. Then again, except for him, we never did. I wish you'd break down and write a history of pro wrestling book so I wouldn't feel like such a ghoul waiting for somebody to die. Keith Priest. Kennesaw, Georgia. Wanted to let you know how much I enjoyed the article you did on Sam Mushnick. I'm so grateful that I was able to have seen the shows Mushnick promoted over the years. Our friendship went back nearly 50 years and we had continued to exchange letters and holiday greetings until his health became the worst. He was an icon, if not the icon of all the wrestling promoters. Diane Devine. Denver, Colorado. Absolutely fabulous writing on the life and career of Sam Mushnick. Your ability to research, summarize, and put into context the history of the sport, a term I use specifically in honor of the memory of Mushnick, is unparalleled. A movie documentary could be made with photos, film clips, stills, and the narration of your text. A&E is a logical place for it to be done. People my age reading this issue will be taken back to a special time, before the internet and the Observer, when information about pro wrestling was pretty scarce to come by as a fan, but the suspension of disbelief was considerably easier. Dory Funk vs. Jack Briscoe on the cover of an Apter magazine, and photos of Ric Flair, Harley Race, Dick the Bruiser and the legendary Kiel Auditorium bordered on mythical to those of us who had only magazine photos to go on. Today's promoters could benefit enormously from reading your account of how Mushnick treated the business and everyone involved. The behind-the-scenes politics has always fascinated me the most about wrestling. How and why things took place. Granted, wrestling has and must change. As we get older, we have the tendency to wax nostalgic about the old days and make them out to be somehow better than they really were. But Mr. Mushnick has left a legacy well worth telling and you did him an honor in telling it very well. WCW ought to consider running on a national scale the way St. Louis used to be run. They have the performers to do a more realistic, more competitive version of pro wrestling. If they could eliminate the nonsensical angles, the no-shows, all the run-ins and ref bump screw job finishes, they might make a run at being number one. Certainly, they would distinguish themselves as being a totally different product from their opposition in a very positive way, far more than just having less abusive language and gestures. Bill Gilger. Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Response from Dave Meltzer. Times change and there is no way to transfer in its entirety things that were successful in 1979 into 1999. Wrestling today has to be sold as entertainment as opposed to fake sport, although it should have elements of both. Even today's real sports performers can't get over doing straight sports interviews the likes of which Mushnick's champions did. However, there are a lot of promotional concepts in regard to the company and announcers maintaining credibility, not overhyping, not lying to the fans. Particularly lying when the truth makes as good a story, screwing the fans whether it be false advertising or on finishes, and at least making the big title and the holder of it and the people chasing it a credible entity as opposed to simply another part of the sideshow that would all work today. Remember that in Mushnick's day, no other wrestling promotion operated quite in his manner, and yet his was generally the most consistent drawing city in the country except New York, and there is a huge population-based difference in the two cities. His feeling was by not overhyping things, you may give up some business on the big show or for the short term, but you don't lose credibility in the process and leaves you with more loyalty from your base audience because they never feel screwed. That seemed to work since his company with the one exception never had the down periods when people had been hyped to the point of numbness that plagued every other modern wrestling company. Storm vs. Van Dam. Just a small complaint. When writing match results, do you actually watch the match or are you retelling someone else's account? Perhaps I'm a bit too detail conscious or even a bit anal retentive, but I find it frustrating when match details are incorrect. Your recent account of my pay-per-view match with Rob Van Dam strongly resembled our match, but had a couple of moves credited to the wrong person and a false finish out of order or wrong. Maybe these details are insignificant, but in a newsletter that voices its opinions as absolute, it would be nice if the actual facts were as well. Lance Storm. Calgary, Alberta. Response from Dave Meltzer. I watch every pay-per-view match. In doing match write-ups, the idea is not to list moves or spots in order but attempt to tell the story of the match, listing things that stick out after it's over and thus had impact, and not necessarily to place those spots in their specific order. If a spot is credited to the wrong person, that's an unforgivable mistake. Foley. In a great example of irony, on January 23rd I received the latest issue of The Observer and read with interest the excerpts from the Dynamite Kid interview along with your comments. The next night I watched one of the sickest spectacles I've ever seen. Mick Foley desperately needs to put a stop to this sick self-abuse. He has paid far more in a real sense than almost any other performer of this era. I'm speaking as someone who has been trained and is trying to get back in shape to hopefully make my debut this summer. Most fans, even the ones who read you religiously, really don't understand the type of punishment you go through in the ring. To compound it needlessly, the way Mick has is frightening. I received a severe concussion this past summer in a car accident while recovering from knee injuries suffered in training. The doctor told me that I needed to be extremely careful when going back and that if I get another concussion, I should like about quitting. For 6 weeks I had to struggle with memory loss and mood swings while trying to keep my business going. So once again, Foley has raised the bar. No doubt on the next ECW pay-per-view show, somebody will try and top it, all in the name of hardcore. And a business many of us love becomes more difficult to watch. I can't understand why these guys do it. Especially the guys in ECW. Their brain cells aren't going to come back. They can't be making the kind of money that will carry them through life when they need to quit. I feel fortunate that I'm self-employed in real estate, and if I need to make a choice between a six-figure career in real estate and wrestling, having to take the punishment that is becoming more common, it's not a hard choice. But I know others would make a different choice and others don't have the options I have. Foley, McMahon and Heyman need to think about this and what Foley is doing to try and get over. Name withheld by request. Response from Dave Meltzer. One of the ironies of modern fans is that they treat the performers more as celebrities than fans of any other era, yet at the same time putting them on that pedestal dehumanizes them as people. It's been amazing to me that when the biggest stars of the era like Austin and Michaels suffered potential and probable career-ending injuries, just how little concern there was from most fans as compared with even 8 years ago when Sting suffered a knee injury that basically was going to keep him out for 6 months but wasn't considered career-ending. In far too many cases, the same people who will pay $20 for an autograph on Sunday won't give it a second's thought about a broken neck, and or drug addictions to curb the pain of such when coming back for that same performer on Monday. I know it's dangerous to generalize like that, and many fans who know the performers personally don't fall into that category, but as a general rule, most everyone close to the situation recognizes it to be the case. Raw. I want to raise a few points, partly in response to letter writers, partly to you, and also some comments of my own. Regarding the letter by Chris Cruz about the deplorable direction and content of WWF telecasts, I think there may be another way of looking at this that deserves consideration. Pop culture changes over time. The values it is ostensibly promoting, such as how far you can go, what is funny, what is acceptable to laugh at, winds up that with most people there comes a time when they reach an age which causes them to say that's enough for me and they hop off the cutting edge. It could be the Beatles, Marilyn Manson, South Park or Raw. There isn't necessarily a right or a wrong. Concerned parents and media consumers aren't necessarily fuddy-duddies and out of touch, but the makers of the shows aren't necessarily profiteers or prophets, or promoters of amoralism. The WWF is presenting an old product in a new way, the aim being, and you have covered this, to engender some type of fervent reactions that the old-style wrestling did during its time. To do so they've altered the product to fit what they see as the entertainment mix of the time and the preferences of their audience. I'm not comfortable with the generalization that some sort of moral indictment can be drawn against the WWF for this. If the teenagers like it, they're accomplishing what they are attempting to. If young kids like it, maybe the same is true. I find myself drawn to the idea that if kids shouldn't be watching the show, that's the responsibility of parents, not the WWF. The WWF is a TV entertainment producer, not a daycare center. Regardless of how aggressively something is marketed to kids, that certainly doesn't mean they are going to like it. In the case of WWF, a lot of kids do. It is a new face of pop culture. Whether it's an appropriate one or not is a decision for their parents. I find most of the Raw skits very entertaining, some of it puerile, and an occasional angle or skit contextually questionable, Mark Henry and PMS, or outlandishly dumb, Austin/MC Mahan's stalker angle and the embalming idiocy with Undertaker. Maybe on that stuff I'm out of touch. It strikes me that some of your letter writers have truly jumped off the pop culture express. WCW has just had, by their standards, 2 very hot nitros. If that's the best they can do, their only hope is NBC, and the WWF not striking an equivalent network deal. The main issue angles are hot, but that still leaves 2 or more hours of nitro full of guys that don't matter, issues that nobody would care about if anyone, including the bookers, could explain what they are, and matches that threaten to shorten viewers' thumbs working the fast-forward button. Lord help you if you watch it live. The somewhat peekaboo genius of Vince McMahon continues to make somebodies out of nobodies. Nitro manufactures nobodies out of people fans are begging to make stars out of, squash gifted entertainers, and then push human-shaped sleeping pills that nobody, including their immediate family, could possibly want to see. As TV producers they seem perennially short of a clue. Chris Jericho is over, so he's done nothing but jog up and down the middle of the cards. The Goldberg/Elizabeth angle was excruciatingly dull, not to mention dull-witted, and lasted the length of the show. Putting Bischoff as an announcer was the germ of an interesting idea, not thought through well, and wound up screwing up the announcing for the entire show. In WWF, everyone has a storyline. There's a reason, even if it's stupid, why every segment is on the air. The angles come so thick and fast they can probably afford to carry the ones that are ill-conceived, poorly executed, or just plain duds. Star power may carry the day for WCW the way it once did, but a risk they may not have considered is that, going by current form, they may just prove to a bigger audience that they can't produce an entertaining television show. Maybe they should hire Vince to book it. I somewhat disagree on your calls on some WWF performers. I think it's a little bit of an overstatement to say the Outlaws are just a ring entrance, and have thought so for some time. Both have their own charisma. Road Dogg has a great voice, sometimes a great delivery and rap to match. When it comes to working, there are plenty better, but compared to those at the same level in WCW, they work reasonably hard, take bumps, and sell when the time comes. With good opponents, they can have a good match. I thought both singles matches on the show Road Dogg won the hardcore title in were okay. I also thought Test was better in the Raw Tag main event than you gave him credit for. Have you noticed the Hardy Boys just about killing themselves to get over on Heat? You're dead right about Brian Christopher. He's a hell of a performer. The prize for hard work and not getting over goes to Jeff Jarrett. His work is actually getting better, but I've never seen someone with negative charisma like he has, not counting that Nitro match with Hugh Morris versus Glacier. I'd rather sit and watch a real Glacier. Luckily Jarrett doesn't have to worry about it as long as he's parked next to the re-landscaped Deborah McMichael. Julian Licht. Camberwell, Victoria, Australia. Burt Ray. Here's something I didn't see in The Observer. Did you know that Uncle Burt Ray, the former Matmania editor from the 60s, died on September 25, 1998? He was in his 60s and apparently lived out in your neck of the woods in the San Francisco area. Get this. In the late 80s, he threw out all his wrestling stuff, figuring that nobody had any use for it. Can you believe that? Joel Colesrud. Comanche, Iowa. Wrestling with Shadows. How can you possibly say the issues and the conflict between Bret Hart and Vince McMahon is not a black and white issue, but that there are gray areas? After reading the very thorough and excellent coverage of the whole situation in The Observer and viewing the documentary, I have a hard time figuring out how anybody can even begin to justify Vince McMahon's point of view. Vince McMahon probably can't even justify it to himself. One can argue that Hart was too much of a mark for his own character, but he clearly was within his rights to do what he did according to his contract. McMahon clearly breached that contract by preventing Hart from having reasonable creative control of his character over the last 30 days. While I live in the real world and understand that almost every single situation has some gray areas, I would be very hard-pressed to find any situation more black and white than this one. Please don't try to justify it with the argument that Vince was just doing what he thought he had to do to protect his company. That argument holds no water, because it could then be used to justify any illegal action taken by anybody in any business, including lying, cheating, stealing, and even killing. The bottom line is, Vince McMahon was both legally and ethically wrong. Bret Hart was both legally and ethically within his rights. I was probably more bothered than I should have been finding out the PWI year-end awards poll results are not authentic. While I was pretty knowledgeable about pro wrestling before reading newsletters, I always assumed that even though the stories in the magazines weren't authentic, that the readers' awards had to be. Wouldn't you assume something like that would be illegal? I understand fans don't pay to vote, therefore it's not 900-line fraud where the results would have to be a shoot, but they are still selling the magazine based on awards being picked by us, the readers. Is this yet another case of PWI getting by with something mainstream magazines wouldn't because it's only wrestling? Steve Muller. Dakota, Minnesota. Response from Dave Meltzer. I'm not going to even attempt to defend McMahon's actions because every defense I've read for them has been pathetic, and believe me, I'd love to see something that at least justifies his position without any BS about creative control not having to do with finishes, which is as ridiculous as saying intercourse has nothing to do with sexual relations, because any argument defending McMahon about that clause being vague is irrelevant once McMahon agreed to the finish, or coming up with personal knocks on Hart's character that may very well be accurate but are irrelevant to this story. Hart could be the single biggest asshole who ever lived, and he's not. But even if he were, he still didn't do anything that he didn't have the contractual right to do. But I do believe that McMahon himself, who as long has an inability to see things from any point of view but his own, in his own mind felt he did the right thing even if he had to deceive his employees and his wrestlers about Hart's actions in order to get them to see his side of it. I believe his side is that the guy who signs a contract has to live up to it because they signed a contract, that he made all of them stars so they should be loyal to him for that, but even though they made him money, he as the owner shouldn't have any loyalty to them because that's their job, and he paid them well for it. And that he doesn't have to live up to the letter of his contracts because it's his money and his business. He certainly doesn't find it noble when wrestlers have been deceptive to him, but he feels he has the right to be, and attributes it to having big balls rather than having no balls, as others would view the same situation, because that's how the wrestling business, as he knows it, operates smoothly. The shades of gray I'm referring to are more as they regard Hart and his actions, such as hinting initially on television he was leaving over the direction of the company when there were many other major aspects involved. McMahon was no better in the week before the match trying to publicly portray Hart as having sold out for Turner's money when the truth was hardly that simple, or his punching McMahon in the dressing room, or even being so adamant about not doing the job in Montreal, although even if I wasn't sure if it was that big an issue at the time, I recognized it was clearly within his contractual rights to do so. 1 year later I am sure he did the right thing as it regards not agreeing to put Michaels over in Montreal, largely because of how the angle went down and because clearly the intent by McMahon, which didn't work, although by all ironies WCW actions accomplished the same purpose, but it was the intent, was to ruin his marketability in Canada, and also because Michaels 4 days earlier had refused to do the job in the same match, and once he copped an attitude, Hart, who had the contractual right to refuse, something Michaels apparently didn't have, shouldn't have put him over in Montreal, or for that matter, anywhere else, even though Hart said to McMahon that afternoon he'd have no problem putting Shawn over outside of Canada. I now believe he shouldn't have even offered that much under the circumstances, even though he was leaving the company. My own thoughts as to that punch have changed greatly over the past year, from believing absolutely it was wrong to a lot more ambiguous thoughts. It's hard to condone it, but watching the movie and the circumstances at the time, it's hard to say it was wrong. It's a shade of gray issue. Even if it was the wrong call, it can be attributed by bad judgment under stress, and one can see justification at least to a degree given the circumstances. All of this is irrelevant toward justifying McMahon's actions on the day. It would be as foolish to think this was part of some great long-range plan by McMahon which worked, although for business obviously it did work, than to attribute Bill Clinton getting a blowjob to a brilliantly thought-up calculated plan to get himself viewed as one of the most popular presidents of all time and to destroy the political power of his archenemies in the religious right because of how the scenarios wound up playing out before the public, as opposed to being what it was, nothing more than a blowjob. A better wrestling analogy would be Akira Maeda's actions attributed to his amazing business foresight when he sucker-kicked Riki Choshu in the eye, when in fact, it was simply an act of total cowardice built out of frustration, and the end result was just one of those weird things that happen in life. Like McMahon's actions, and to a totally different degree Clinton's, that wound up by some weird twist of fate drawing money at the other end, but none of the three actions were actions of bravery, brilliance, guts, or have any reasonable justification except you never know how things are going to turn out at the end. I don't know what any legalities there are about presenting work poll results in magazines. There are laws against 900-line frauds, but I'd bet within pro wrestling 900-line frauds on polls and contests have existed on several occasions. Foley. In no way do I mean to compare Tony Schiavone's silly comments about Mick Foley with the Holocaust, but hearing you defend Schiavone on the grounds he was doing what Eric Bischoff told him to is a bit like the Nazi soldiers who defended their actions by saying they were only doing their job. Certainly this doesn't remotely approach genocide, but it does point out an underlying problem in wrestling, and in society as a whole, that nobody is ever really responsible for their own actions. How many times have they asked Bobby Heenan to be part of their moronic competition bashing, only to be turned down? The obvious exception was his veiled tirade against Howard Finkel following the Joey Morella funeral, but that was his own idea. Even Mike Tenay, who is lower on the totem pole than Shivani, generally doesn't sink to those depths when carrying out his duties. Would Shivani have been fired if he refused? I don't think so. Shivani is a valuable employee whose greatest value to WCW is as a hard-working, loyal company man who probably does the work of 3 men if the truth were to be told. But this was more than just an average dig at the competition. This cut to the bone. Mick Foley, in the 5 years he worked for WCW, was the one person the company could truly count on. It didn't matter how many broken bones, concussions, or severed body parts he had, if he was expected to show up and perform, then he crawled out of bed and gave the paying customer his or her money's worth. Saying it's just wrestling and that is how things are done in this business sounds just as hollow as the people who say things like boys will be boys and no means yes. The wrestling business is what the people who operate it choose to make it. I refuse to accept that Bischoff or McMahon's philosophies on how to treat people are superior to those of Mushnick or Bosch. Which brings me to the point about Mushnick's death. What reason would Vince McMahon possibly have to mention Sam Mushnick? You know as well as I do that the pro wrestling industry didn't even exist before 1984. Even Bischoff knows that. To acknowledge Mushnick as anything more than a local St. Louis promoter would be an admission to the world that without Mushnick holding the dogs at bay and keeping other promoters from attempting to cannibalize the lethargic, overfed dinosaur that was the WWF of the 60s and 70s, Titan Sports would have probably never even existed. Bischoff wouldn't have mentioned Mushnick because he probably thought he was a character in The Wizard of Oz, and even if he had a clue as to who he was, why would he show any more respect for him than he did for any of the other people who helped build the industry and the company he feeds off like Steamboat, Race, Austin, Foley, Waltman, Flair, and others that he discarded? Bischoff's ego now seems to have grown to the point he feels he can disregard something as powerful as a federal court order. I seem to remember back in 1993, a federal court judge in Charlotte ruled that WCW had no legal right to make any claim to the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, following the Ric Flair vs. Rick Rude fiasco at the Disney Studios. Yet on WCW's newly redesigned website, they are now boldly proclaiming that the WCW World Heavyweight Championship was formerly known as the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Not only that, but they continue to proclaim Ric Flair as a 13-time WCW champion, despite the fact that 8 of those reigns were NWA title reigns and 2 were WWF. That would be like WCW taking credit for Andre vs. Hogan at WrestleMania 3. If that's not confusion of the marketplace, I don't know what is. It's beyond me why Howard Brody doesn't ask Bischoff very nicely to cut it out. The NWA World title may be a minor league belt now, but it's still a protected trademark of that organization. Every time Shivani rambles on with that 1905 BS, you know, when Karl Gotch held the NWA heavyweight title, it makes it seem like WCW is the real NWA, just with a different name, and that the actual NWA is the cheap imitator. If you go by WCW logic, then why can't WWF and ECW both claim that their world titles were formerly known as the NWA World Title too? Their world title formations were pretty much identical to WCW's. They were dues-paying members of the NWA, they dropped out and they created their own world titles out of thin air. End of story. The WCW World Title is not, nor has it ever been, the NWA World Title. To the best of my knowledge, Jack Briscoe never hit Dory Funk Jr. with a stun gun and Harley Race never went down from a Ric Flair finger blow. And by the way, Ric Flair's U.S. title victory over Tim Woods took place on April 8, 1978 in Charlotte, Norfolk. Richard Sullivan. Belmont, North Carolina. Response from Dave Meltzer. Bischoff was sitting there and told Shivani what to say. An announcer in this business is a paid shill who does what he's told, and not an independent broadcaster like would be the case in some real sports. If Tenay or Heenan or Cole or Ross were ordered by the boss to say something, they do. They may complain, but ultimately they do even if they don't like doing it. To blame Shivani is as silly as blaming Michael Cole or Kevin Kelly for announcing the Gilbert segments on WWF, which are basically just as low class. There was a period of about 18 months after the WCW name was adopted, when the NWA and WCW World Heavyweight titles were basically, although not legally, the same thing. Michaels. The Shawn Michaels career chronicle was interesting. If I can add some absolutely useless trivia to this story, and there is no reason you or anybody else should even remember this, Michaels and Marty Jannetty made a very brief stop in the Continental promotion here in Alabama after their first AWA run ended. They were being groomed for a program with the stud stable, Robert Fuller and Jimmy Golden. Within a month of their debut, they vanished. I'm not sure if it was before or after Memphis. In the story you claim that Michaels politicked Vader out of the title picture and replaced him with Sid. I seem to remember you reporting that the reason to go with Sid instead of Vader was the departure of J.J. Dillon, who at that time had just left WWF for WCW. The feeling was that Dillon would spread the word at WCW about the upcoming Vader win, so Vince swerved it with a Sid victory instead. I can't wait for Nitro to return to Birmingham so I can hear Ric Flair mention on national television such wrestling legends as Jackie Fargo, Len Rossi, Tojo Yamamoto, Gypsy Joe, and of course, Nick Gulas. Jim Ward. Birmingham, Alabama. Response from Dave Meltzer. On the Sid Vader deal, the way we first heard the switch in plans was attributed to Dillon leaving the company. Later we learned Michaels had politicked McMahon to do the program with Sid instead. Ultimately, like everything else, it was McMahon's decision, and his exact reasons only he knows, although Sid was more of a Vince champion than Vader would be. You can also understand, Vader being the better worker and more reliable when it comes to being put in a top position. Well, everyone is more reliable than Sid. Why, even though Sid fit the mold better, why, given the choice, many would want Vader in the spot. And perhaps Vince was always going to go with Sid, and Michaels' politicking just happened to take place at the same time, and just swerved Vader to get him to do jobs for months for Michaels, promising him the belt at Rumble to keep him happy, then coming up with some circumstance to pull the rug from him. Awards. Some comments on the awards issue. It's nice to see the WWF start coming up with new tag teams again after another atrocious year for tag teams. It's really a treat to listen to any of the wrestlers who finished in the top 10 on interviews. Most overrated? Same bums, different year? Rookie of the year? Doesn't Val Venus qualify? Poor Papi Chulo. What a difference a year makes. Best announcer? A great void in wrestling. There used to be so many good ones. Now there are but a few. We've got a local guy with the WWA who is better than several of the top 10. Worst announcer? Same bums, different year? Worst show? Should be a top 3 category. Too many bad WCW shows to choose from. Best maneuver? I love the corporate elbow, but I believe the spirit of this award is that it should go to a skillful maneuver. The Diamond Cutter won last year and it was also overrated hype. Most disgusting promotional tactic also should be a top 3 category. This has gotten worse over the last year. I'd also like to see favorite and least favorite as top 3 categories. Steve Lockwood. Shoreview, Minnesota. Response from Dave Meltzer. Val Venus has wrestled for several years in Canada, Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Japan as Sean Morley and is part of a tag team called the Glamour Boys. In Mexico for much of 1997, he held the CMLL World Heavyweight title as the Masked Steel. I can't believe that Steve Austin won Wrestler of the Year. What is the wrestling world coming to? The guy only has 5 moves, and flipping off Vince McMahon is one of them. This was by far one of the worst years for wrestling I've ever seen. Mitsuharu Misawa was a far better wrestler than Steve Austin in 1998, even with all his injuries. We are talking Wrestler of the Year. Austin had more wrestling moves in WCW. I hope this doesn't turn into a popularity contest because that would be sad. Another thing is that nobody else seemed to pick the Shinjiro Otani vs. Ultimo Dragon match from the January 4th Tokyo Dome show as one of the best matches of the year. The match was far superior to some of the top 10 and honorable mention matches. Takakura Osaka. San Jose, California.